Good news.
Sorry, where the
Bill, you do sound great. I'm not sure
looking for one.
Mr. Price.
Brad Snyder's on the call.
All right, folks, just letting you know we're about to go live. Just one last reminder, if you can look at the top right of your screen, there will be a little button saying layout. If you click the layout button, it'll launch into the next page. That'll make sure that you can see the view room during the proceedings. And if you scroll your mouse over any of the top 5 panelists on the top of your screen, you'll see 3 dots up here. If you click on those 3 dots, you will see a box pop up saying lock is in this location. Click on that box and a small window of the search bar will appear. Just type in timer into that search bar. Click on timer and that will ping the clock on your screen. Folks, so you know the hearing room is not going live.
Five, four, three, two, one. The Committee on Ways and Means will now come to order. The chair has determined that a quorum is present, and we are holding today's meeting in a hybrid format in compliance with rules and regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. While I certainly hope that by now we would all be able to safely gather together in this historic room in the interest of protecting the health of members and staff alike, we are continuing to limit the number of people in this room at any one time and encourage members to participate remotely. I want to remind you of a few procedures to hopefully keep these proceedings running as smoothly as possible, and a special word of acknowledgement to staff members on both sides for helping to bring about this day. First, consistent with regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Committee staff will mute members only in the event of an inadvertent background noise should it occur. Second, when members are present in the proceeding, they must have their cameras on. If you need to step away to attend another proceeding, please turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out of the platform. I think it's fair to say we will not be adhering to the Gibbons rule this morning, and on the West Coast it certainly is this morning. Third, when a question is put before the committee, members who are present on the WebEx platform are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. Finally, in the event of a request for a record vote, we will pause proceedings to allow the clerk to have time to set up. All members who are present remotely should stay on the platform to vote. Please do not come to the hearing room if you are already present remotely. Once the clerk is ready, we will proceed through the roll call until every member has had the opportunity to vote. Please be advised that all members will be responsible for unmuting themselves when called upon. I thank you all for your patience and cooperation as we continue navigating these new procedures to serve our country together in this great time of need. I reminded staff yesterday that this is not unlike President Eisenhower's determination to allow press conferences to be filmed for the first time, or President Jack Kennedy's determination to allow his press conferences to go live. It is the constant churning of the advances of technology battling this pandemic that bring us to this moment. Now, let me turn to the subject of our meeting today. Putting the American people first by advancing legislation to confront the economic and health challenges posed by COVID-19 and the pandemic. More than a year has passed since the first case of COVID-19 was recorded in the United States. In that time, Americans across the country have seen their lives upended. For many, they have had the misfortune to have been infected with this awful virus, and if not them, a loved one. As we head toward more than 25 million cases that have been acknowledged and 500,000 people in the American family who have perished, this is the moment. Far too many have paid the ultimate price, and the corresponding economic crisis has caused widespread job loss, with up to 19 million Americans receiving unemployment insurance. A quarter of U.S. adults say that someone in their household lost their job because of the coronavirus. A quarter of adults report having had trouble paying their bills. 17% report having received help from a food bank. 1 in 6 have had problems paying their rent or their mortgage. These statistics are not just numbers. They represent our struggling neighbors, friends, family, and kids who deserve and need more help. Their hardships cannot be understated. Throughout this crisis, the Ways and Means Committee has led some of the most significant provisions in Congress's COVID response legislation. Our member efforts have helped keep jobless workers afloat, families in their homes, employees connected to their employers, all while giving first responders the resources they needed to fight this disastrous virus. This committee's quick, thorough work prevented even greater catastrophe and truly provided lifelines for Americans badly in need. However, we are far from the light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. Almost a fifth of the total deaths from this virus occurred in the last month, and January's jobs report showed how hardly any job creation has been reported. Anyone who thinks we'll recover without intervention isn't paying attention. Unfortunately, too many Americans have been left behind in this haphazard, every state for itself response to the crisis at hand. Ending the public health emergency requires aggressive science-based action, and indeed we acknowledge it takes time. Fortunately, President Biden's American Rescue Plan contains the kind of bold policies congressional Democrats have sought to advance for months. With new leadership in the White House, Congress has the support it needs to kickstart a coordinated federal response. Time is of the essence, and Americans need to know that help is on the way. Economists from both sides of the aisle agree that the risk of not doing enough is far greater than the risk of doing too much. According to Moody's, if we don't act now, we could put 4 million jobs in jeopardy this year, potentially pushing full employment even further out into the next year. Confronting these sobering realities, we have been left no choice but to move forward with budget reconciliation as a process to move relief legislation as quickly as we can to get relief to the American people. So long as lives and livelihoods are at stake, we are called to this action. Today, we are considering proposals that will give Americans a sense of security in a time of overwhelming uncertainty. This includes the security of knowing that the second part of the $2,000 check is on the way. For the lowest income families, this means affording life's most basic necessities and simultaneously helping to create demand. We want to build upon the special enrollment period that President Biden recently announced by making it even easier for the unemployed to afford health insurance. Working in tandem with COBRA subsidies and allowing us to better capture the most vulnerable Americans who typically aren't offered health insurance through their employer is to be acknowledged. We also will enhance and expand refundable tax credits for low and middle income workers and their families. This means making the largest expansion of EITC for workers without children since 2009, and both increasing the child tax credit and making it fully refundable and advanceable. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy estimates that such expansions, along with direct assistance, would provide an average boost in income of 33% for the poorest 20% of American households. This will be a major tool in lifting millions of children out of poverty, and it will change lives. We will also consider legislation to help crush the virus in nursing homes and another to shore up multi-employer pension plans that have been further jeopardized by COVID-19. Over the next many hours and days, we will debate legislative proposals that are immensely important to the American people. I know this committee is up to it. They are proposals that many of our families and neighbors need to stay afloat in this incredibly challenging time. And so, we will rise to the moment, roll up our sleeves, debate the merits, listen to competing visions, but always, in the end, to get this job done. The American people at this moment are counting on us. And with that, let me yield to the ranking member, Mr. Brady, for the purposes of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neal. Congress's top priority right now is to work together to crush this virus and rebuild this economy by helping Main Street businesses survive and helping the jobless get back to work, which is why we joined forces not once, not twice, but 5 times last year to provide the largest recovery package in American history, $3.55 trillion in emergency COVID relief. Despite an economic recovery that widely beat expectations, more work needs to be done. But any further action needs to be focused on destroying this virus and rebuilding our economy in a timely and efficient way. Economists on both sides of the aisle, including President Obama's economic advisor, agree targeted is the right way to go. This nearly $2 trillion stimulus package is neither targeted nor a stimulus. We repeatedly asked the White House a simple question: how many jobs will this stimulus create? Repeatedly, the Biden administration ducked this important question, still refusing to provide an official answer. Whatever this rushed, partisan special interest stimulus package does, it comes with no bipartisan discussion, no opportunity for finding common ground, and no credible estimates of jobs. Help for Main Street businesses? Nope. And worse, these bills include controversial job-killing mandates. The Independent Congressional Budget Office reports will slash 1.4 million jobs over the next few years, especially for the young and poorly educated workers. This one provision will expand the national deficit by $54 billion. Why? To pay for government checks needed to help all the jobless created by this bill. Not satisfied at job killing, Democrats are including a provision to encourage American businesses to ship jobs and investment overseas. Another repeat of the Obama-Biden economic failures. I don't know if the White House knows this, but you're supposed to be creating jobs, not killing them. For businesses looking to hire, and there are over 6.6 million job openings today, there's more bad news. We need to help the jobless, but the one-size-fits-all $400 a week federal unemployment check on top of the state unemployment benefits means over half of American workers will be paid more to stay at home than to work. How will stay jobless incentives get our local economies moving? And why should anyone get paid more by taxpayers to stay home than to get back to work? There is a third round of stimulus checks that many experts admit are probably more a political stimulus than an economic one. Costing nearly $500 billion, these checks do little to help Main Street businesses survive or get people back to work. For example, for the same amount spent on the stimulus checks, you could give directly over 10 million jobless workers a $40,000 voucher for training or to split with the potential employer to fill and start a full-time job. For the same amount of the stimulus checks, over 85% of workers could work income tax-free for all of 2021. Can you imagine people going to work for themselves each day for a year rather than for Washington, expanding their family budgets and spurring Main Street economies? We can do more to save jobs in the industries that will take longer to recover. In this package, of course, are higher subsidies for the failing Obamacare program. Others with COBRA will get larger health care subsidies than they get at work, and other incentives to stay home rather than rejoin the workforce. There is a bit of good news. Democrats haven't yet included their huge tax breaks for millionaires with the SALT repeal, which experts in both parties agree does nothing for the middle class. We do have serious differences. Chairman, I hope we can work together. Americans across the country are worrying whether this bitter, divided, partisan beginning to a Democratic Congress and Biden administration is the new normal. Headlines this week read, "Inside Biden world's plan to punish the GOP for opposing COVID relief." And quote, "An easy choice inside Biden's decision to go it alone with Democrats on coronavirus relief." For a president that ran on uniting and his ability to work across the aisle, this is the beginnings of what may be the most partisan administration in modern history. Instead, let's find common ground on crushing the virus and rebuilding this economy. This package isn't it, and will fail much as the Obama-Biden stimulus failed, which led to the worst economic recovery in our lifetime. Americans are counting on us not to repeat that historic mistake. But that can only happen if our Democrat friends choose to put down their partisan gloves, roll up their sleeves, and work with us. With that, Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. Our first order of business will be the consideration of Subtitle A of the Budget Reconciliation Legislative Recommendations relating to crisis support for unemployed workers. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neal, for allowing me to provide an opening statement for this historic markup so that we can deliver much-needed relief to individuals and families that have been devastated by this COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we gather to consider the unemployment insurance subtitle as part of our work to advance President Biden's American Rescue Act. This committee is intimately familiar with the reality of the unemployment crisis and the need for additional benefits. Up until this pandemic, Nevada's unemployment rate was the lowest ever around this time last year at 3.6%, and the country's unemployment rate was at 3.5%. Simply put, Americans were working. And then this pandemic came about, crushing our economies, wiping out savings, and taking jobs away. Well, I want to appeal to my Republican colleagues that may be reluctant to provide expanded unemployment insurance to Americans. Nevadans and Americans all throughout the country lost their jobs because of a pandemic, the worst health and economic pandemic of our lifetimes. Not because they choose not to work. Americans do not want pandemic emergency assistance. They don't want to stay home. Americans need pandemic emergency assistance. For too many, what we decide here in Congress is a matter of life and death. Today, almost a year since the onset of this pandemic, we are unfortunately still far from real economic recovery. Americans are still tired and they're barely hanging on. Last week's jobs report showed that while we are trying to control this devastating pandemic and contain the economic downturn, unemployment remains high. Currently, nearly 18 million workers are relying on unemployment benefits to try and stay afloat. My home state of Nevada had the second highest unemployment rate at 9.2% at the end of 2020, only behind the state of Hawaii. Each week, the number of new applications for unemployment benefits is still at levels never seen before this pandemic. Millions have drained their savings as a result of the lapse in benefits forced by my colleagues on the other side last summer, and they have yet to financially recover. Additionally, this is an issue of inequity. While the pandemic has impacted virtually everyone, it has disproportionately harmed women and people of color, and they will be the most harmed if federal unemployment benefits end. The Congressional Budget Office found that Black workers were disproportionately receiving unemployment benefits when congressional Republicans forced a cutoff of supplemental unemployment benefits last summer. And that would likely be the case now as well. unless we pass the American Rescue Act. Blacks and other people of color are less likely to be able to telework and more likely to have to become unemployed during the pandemic. Many of my Black and Latino constituents work in the casino, hotels, and restaurants that we all love to go to when traveling to Las Vegas, and we'll be welcoming you back soon. But the work they do cannot be done remotely, and they cannot go back to work until we crush this virus and make it safe to do so. In December of 2020, according to Forbes, women accounted for 100% of the job losses in the economy, continuing a trend of much higher job loss among women during the pandemic. Many people of color are also likely to have to wait longer to be able to return to work because of their high risk. Black and Latino Americans are almost 3 times as likely to die from COVID-19. And for many of the workers who rely on them, unemployment benefits mean being able to afford basic necessities like food and shelter as they remain out of work through no fault of their own. We also cannot overlook the role these benefits have played in stabilizing our economies. Back in April, the Brookings Institution estimated that unemployment benefits offset roughly half of lost wages. As it presently stands, unemployment workers are facing a lapse in federal unemployment benefits as soon as March 14th. So I'm proud that my bill to expand the federal pandemic unemployment compensation from $300 per week to $400 per week through August 29th of this year is included in today's markup. As their congressional representatives, we were selected by the American people to advocate for them, to help them in times of need, and to vote in their interests. So I'm asking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work together and to pass this critical provision in President Biden's American Rescue Plan. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford. Now, let me recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, for the purposes of offering an opening statement. Ms. Wolarski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Federally funded unemployment compensation has massively expanded in response to the devastation caused by the pandemic and government-imposed shutdowns of economic activity. Last spring, increased unemployment benefits played an important role in helping those who lost a job, and at that time made sense as a way to reduce the economic impact of stay-at-home orders. Now, more than 10 months later, we are facing a much different situation, but Democrats continue to insist on keeping in place enhanced unemployment benefits that discourage work. Our unemployment rate has gone from a spike of 14.7% last April to 6.3% last month. CBO projects a decline in unemployment even with no additional stimulus, reaching 5.3% by the end of the year. Nevertheless, this bill would increase and extend enhanced unemployment benefits to $400 per week through the end of the summer. We know that at this level, unemployment benefits can end up replacing more than 100% of a worker's prior earnings. A better way to get Americans back to work and get our economy back fully up and running would be to target those dollars so supplemental benefits are tailored to each individual. Last June, Democrats on this committee admitted as much in saying in a press release, ideally unemployment compensation would be limited to what out-of-work Americans previously earned, end quote. Like the $600 supplement, the $400 added weekly benefit is crudely designed and poorly suited for the challenge we now face. As safe and effective vaccines are administered and states roll back restrictions on businesses, this is the time to focus on reconnecting workers with jobs. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm also very concerned about the level of fraud we are seeing in these programs. The Labor Department Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office have issued repeated warnings to states about the vulnerability of the CARES Act unemployment insurance programs to abuse. The IG's initial audit and investigation indicate improper payments will be higher than 10%, or at least $63 billion. The Secret Service circulated a memo to its field offices last May saying an international crime ring has been filing unemployment claims in different states using Social Security numbers belonging to identity theft victims, including first responders, government personnel, and school employees. I strongly believe this committee has a responsibility to hold oversight hearings to determine the extent and amount of fraud in the CARES Act unemployment insurance programs and how these tax dollars can be recovered. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The committee will now proceed to consideration of Subtitle A. Without objection, the measure will be considered and open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. Now, let me turn to Morna Miller, the Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Worker and Family Support, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes that have been made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after her presentation. Morna?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The committee print of Subtitle A, Crisis Support for Unemployed Workers, would extend the temporary unemployment programs and supports which were created in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act, and extended in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 through August 29th, 2021. The print also restores full funding for states that waive waiting weeks and increases the federal supplemental unemployment benefit to $400 per week for weeks ending after March 14th, 2021. Together with state unemployment programs, these temporary unemployment programs currently serve approximately 18 million workers and provide financial support to unemployment programs in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes two changes to the committee print. The first is a technical change to number the section containing the short title of the bill as Section 9001. The second change would increase the federal reimbursement percentage for unemployment costs charged to reimbursable employers from 50% to 75%, starting at the beginning of the quarter on April 1st. Reimbursable employers, including most nonprofit organizations, do not pay employer unemployment taxes and instead reimburse states for the cost of all unemployment benefits paid to employees that they lay off. The CARES Act provided a first ever temporary federal subsidy to offset half that cost, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute would extend and increase the temporary subsidy through August 29th, 2021. I would be happy to answer any technical questions that members of the committee have about the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? The gentleman? Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I focus on this first bill before us that is extending unemployment assistance, to which Republicans are unfortunately again saying no. The most recent employment numbers that we have from last month show that our economic recovery has stalled. As one commentator recently noted, 9.1 million fewer jobs than a year earlier is consistent with a severe recession. Established in the time of another crisis, the Great Depression, unemployment insurance assists workers who lose their jobs and contribute to the local economy in the process and help those workers secure productive new jobs. Like so many issues that have been hiding in plain sight and now exposed by the pandemic, this patchwork employment system left up to the states to mismanage and underfund has failed to provide prompt assistance. I've heard firsthand from one person after another, literally hundreds of people that have contacted us in recent months about their inability to connect with the Texas Workforce Commission in order to resolve issues of obstructed benefits. One Austin musician, Lauren Gould, last week reached out to my office for assistance after waiting on hold with the Texas Workforce Commission for 6 hours, only to have her call dropped and never reached again. After overcoming Senate Republicans who said no to pandemic unemployment assistance last spring for both types of workers under the CARES Act, House Democrats passed an extension on May 15th to ensure that this $600 weekly lifeline would not expire in late July. House Republicans said no like today to this lifeline. They continued to say no, while Senate Republicans wouldn't say anything. They simply refused to discuss the matter until after the Texas Workforce Commission had sent out its last supplemental benefit check. Finally, in typical Trump fashion, he announced he'd dictate everything by himself. He engaged in a stunt in which he announced the checks would soon be in the mail. At the same time, he cut weekly assistance in half and excluded nearly 350,000 of the most needy low-income Texans, as well as those whose original application didn't specifically say their loss was from the pandemic. Then 6 weeks later, Trump abruptly stopped these payments, which had used money to pay for them, taken away from the FEMA disaster fund at the height of the wildfire season in the West and the hurricane season in the East. Again in October, House Democrats approved unemployment assistance. Republicans said no, and we had to wait until Christmas before they finally yielded. For gig workers in Texas and elsewhere, it wasn't a white Christmas, it was a dry one, as benefits expired on the day after Christmas. Thankfully, President Joe Biden understands the struggle that so many of these families have endured, and he's insisted upon this prompt action with a true American rescue plan. Today's legislation answers that call to give, as President Biden requested, workers the assurance that they'll have support right on into up to September, though I am a little disappointed that it omits a month of additional assistance that President Biden requested and which Senator Wyden has fortunately committed to restore in the Senate. This assistance is particularly important for gig workers, over 350,000 of them in my state who are receiving pandemic unemployment assistance, including many of our musicians and other contractors who previously would not have been able to receive a dime of support. In addition to this changing nature of our economy, over 40% of the U.S. workforce are now estimated to be gig workers. Since losing employment has left many without health coverage, we have also included in companion legislation to be heard later this week a critical provision for access of the unemployed to zero premium health insurance under the Affordable Care Marketplace. This is a modest step facing some serious implementation obstacles to reach a few of the more than 30 million Americans who remain uninsured. Blocked from Medicaid expansion by obstructionist state leaders, my home state of Texas bears the disgrace of having more uninsured citizens than any other state. An estimated 800,000 Texans could be eligible for coverage under the bills that we will approve this week. For the first time, some Texans previously too poor to receive federal tax credits have the possibility of securing and accessing health insurance. If ever meaningfully implemented, this provision could help us tackle disparities. Mr. Chairman, I support this legislation. I believe it protects the economic security of Americans and also offers some protection for health security. Hopefully, we can achieve both, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding to me. I want to talk a little bit about unemployment and how this has an impact on so many of us. The responsibility of this committee is to pursue policies that help rebuild our economy and help crush and defeat the virus. We owe it to the small business owners who've been forced to shut down and their families who are struggling as a result of lost wages or jobs. However, this $1.9 trillion package will just benefit the left-wing wish list items, while another $1 trillion is already unspent from previous relief bills. The whole budget process has been distorted by the use of the Democrats to abuse it in favor of untargeted spending and offer some of the worst fiscal policies this nation has ever seen, like a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. In fact, President Biden has yet to give his administration's estimate of the number of jobs that will be created by this massive spending bill. American people don't need more government regulation or mandates. They deserve to have lawmakers in their corner who will fight with them to get their jobs back, keep their businesses open, and reopen schools. We can increase job opportunities and wages for all workers. It was just a few years ago that we saw real results with tax and regulatory reforms, like the first actual wage growth in decades and historic unemployment lows. We can restore our nation's economy to a place of growth and prosperity, but not when radical left-wing agendas sabotage these efforts every step of the way. We have the tools to defeat the virus. The United States is exceptional and resilient. Since the very beginning, we've been a nation of innovators. It's American ingenuity and grit that will allow us to bounce back from this pandemic, not the failed policies of big government and unrestrained spending. I'm disappointed that my colleagues would support this self-serving bill over the needs of so many Americans. Unemployment insurance plays such a role in helping workers during this pandemic, but Democrats, along with the Biden administration, continue to push unemployment policies that discourage job seekers while simultaneously refusing to support job creators and even killing jobs. For example, in the state of Nevada, if we include this $400 increase from the federal government on top of the state unemployment payments, the median worker will make more than 100% of what they would pay if they were working. That's not going to encourage people to go back to work. So instead of working to get Americans back to work, President Biden wants to increase the federal minimum wage to $15, killing an estimated 1.4 million jobs, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Speaker Pelosi stalled the reopening of the Paycheck Protection Program for months while small businesses closed their doors and laid off their employees. President Biden decisively killed thousands of American energy jobs in his first week in office, and he's seeking to kill even more with his proposed green initiatives. Because of this bill, Americans will have fewer jobs than they do today. It's unconscionable and short-sighted to increase unemployment in a package that results in more unemployed Americans. Federally funded unemployment compensation has already been massively expanded in response to the health crisis as a result of the largely government-imposed shutdowns of economic activity. We passed the CARES Act provisions that expanded unemployment benefits for unemployed individuals by an extra $600 per week on top of their regular state unemployment benefits. This provision hurt our economy more than it helped. Some Americans on this had a higher income than when they were employed. At $600, roughly 68% of those unemployed were making more money on unemployment insurance than on their previous wages. We cannot kickstart our economy when we allow Americans to be dependent on government assistance. Instead, the unemployed should help families pay bills until they are able to find work. It's clear from the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General, at least the letter they sent Congress this week, that there's been massive fraud in the unemployment programs. The fraud is easily expected to top more than $64 billion nationwide. In California alone, unemployment fraud is more than $10 billion, with an additional $20 billion in unemployment payments considered to be suspicious. Democrats have no plan to prevent unemployment insurance fraud. This bill covers 74 weeks of unemployment coverage with no requirement to stop the fraud, although such fraud's been rampant. This bill doesn't include anything to prevent that fraud. What we need to do is focus on how do we get the economies going and how do we focus on making sure that people can get back to work. We need to make sure the schools get reopened. We need to make sure that we support the programs that help individuals in their access of making sure that they get back and able to restart their lives the way we were a year ago before the pandemic hit. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all of the staff that worked so hard on putting this critically important bill before us today. Our committee has jurisdiction over almost half of President Biden's rescue plan, more than any other committee. And I'm grateful to everyone who has worked so hard to bring this relief to the American people. Mr. Chairman, the American people are hurting. It's been almost 11 months since Congress passed the first COVID-19 response bill. In that time, 27 million Americans have gotten terribly sick. 465,000 have died, and the virus is still with us. But what started as a healthcare crisis has proliferated into every facet of our lives. Millions have lost their jobs, with low-wage workers the hardest hit. Small businesses have shut down. Kids can't go to school. Parents can't get childcare. And an estimated 15 million families can't afford the food that they need. And roughly 15 million are behind on rent payments. And that's not to mention the mental health toll the past year has taken on everyone, especially our frontline healthcare workers. Even worse, from top to bottom, the pandemic has exposed and in many cases worsened racial and ethnic disparities already present in our society. These rippling crises will not go away until we crush the virus. But as we expand vaccinations and bolster our healthcare system, it's critical that Congress provide working families with the support they need to continue weathering this storm. And that's why this bill is so important. It provides $1,400 checks to Americans making up to $75,000 per year, a key threshold that I work to maintain with many others on the committee. And it subsidizes COBRA coverage for those who have lost their job. And the bill invests in our children and our working families to expand child care tax credit and the EITC. This crisis is completely unprecedented. In every one of our districts, families are hurting. We have to do whatever it takes to get them help. Now is exactly the time for Congress to spend the money to keep folks afloat. I look forward to supporting this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady, for holding this markup. It's critical that Congress continue working to defeat the virus and reopen our economy. This is my first markup with the committee, and I'm disappointed to see how it's spent so much of its partisanship on this bill that fails to target aid where it's needed most. Since I'm new to this committee, I think my colleagues should know that I understand the issues we're dealing with today on a personal level. I grew up in poverty, unsure if the lights would still be on when I got home from school, if there would be food on the dinner table when I came home at night. My childhood is marked by a dependence on government aid that incentivized my stepdad to stay home rather than work. I've seen what the welfare system does to families. It's built to hold them down rather than to help them up. At a young age, I decided that the example set by my stepdad was not the life I wanted, and I put myself to work. I worked harder and longer than anyone because I knew that my work ethic is what would pull me out of poverty and change the course of my life. I was right, and now I've spent over 34 years as a business owner and job creator across many industries in my communities. There is no social program quite like a job. A hard-earned paycheck is infinitely more valuable than anything from the unemployment office. We need to put Americans back to work, make America tired again. I'd love to be a part of the solution here, and I know many of my colleagues on all sides feel the same way, but none of us on the Republican side were consulted on this bill. Last year, every single COVID relief package was passed with bipartisan support. That will not happen this time because the majority has chosen to abandon their calls for unity without even making an effort. Sadly, it's the American people who will bear the burden of that decision. A year ago, we didn't know much about the virus. We had no clue how dire the economic fallout would become. That uncertainty was reflected in the initial relief legislation we passed, and we threw out money at our problems in the hope that some of that money would find the people who needed it. As a result, there are over $1 trillion left unused from previous relief packages. Today, we are a year wiser. We know much more about the virus, what families and businesses have been hit the hardest. Let's not waste any more taxpayer dollars than we have to. We need to be very targeted in what we do. There is no excuse for exorbitant spending, period. This relief needs to be timely, targeted, and temporary. The lack of targeting on relief bills resulted in billions of dollars being wasted on Americans whose incomes were not impacted by COVID, while millions of Americans who truly needed help were left out to dry. We cannot continue in the same practices that led to those failures. COVID-19 is not an opportunity to take advantage of, to pass as many radical policies as possible. Nothing we do in legislation should be a permanent fix in federal policy. These relief funds should only be used to temporarily assist those whose lives have been turned upside down by the government deciding their jobs are not essential. I have a number of concerns with the bill before us today. I have a serious concern about incentivizing workers to stay on unemployment rather than incentivizing workers to return to the workforce. This bill extends the additional $400 unemployment payment through the end of the summer. This additional payment prevents our families from returning to the workforce, with over 50% of recipients getting paid to stay on welfare than to go back to work. With PPP, we ensure that even businesses were struggling. Their employees would still have a paycheck, which is far more valuable than an unemployment check. We must connect workers with reopening jobs, not pay them to stay out of the workforce. Our economy will recover as quickly or as slowly as we can get Americans back to work. In addition to providing a salary bump with added UI payments, this bill proposes lavish healthcare benefits for the unemployed. Specifically, this legislation subsidizes unemployment healthcare plans that cover abortions, which is a non-starter. Last summer, a report revealed that less than 2% of people who had employer-sponsored healthcare coverage before the pandemic have become uninsured as a result, leading us to believe action on this front is unwarranted at this point. Now is not the time to create new healthcare and welfare programs or prop up old ones. My last concern is with the pension bailout. I don't see how a blank check to unions supports the mission to defeat the virus and reopen the economy. This bill bails out $60 billion in union pensions with no reforms or clarity if another bailout will be necessary down the road. Like I said earlier, I wish Republicans had been consulted on this bill. There's a lot we can do when we work together, as we saw last year, as this committee has historically done, but I have fear on one side of the process will leave Americans unaccounted for in this relief package. The majority is setting a dangerous precedent that should be concerning for all Americans. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, to strike the last word.
You unmute me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join those as well who have thanked the committee for all of its diligence and hard work in putting this package together. I'm struck initially, however, in listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, that this is nothing more than fraud and abuse and misweight, and that they haven't been involved in the process. I'm trying to think where people have been for the last year and what they were focused on. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you especially for the tireless work in putting this legislation together, as well as I want to make sure that we give President Biden the credit he richly deserves for having had the courage to understand the magnitude of this problem and to weigh in on it as his top priority. And far from being rushed, there's a sense of urgency. You heard Mike Thompson say it, and Lloyd as well. 465,000 Americans have died. What does it take to wake up the people on the other side of the aisle? What has to be done in order for you to understand the magnitude of this? Do you not have the same kind of citizens that we do that are suffering back in our district, who not only fear for their lives, but have lost their jobs and their livelihood? You call what we're trying to do here today fraud, and we haven't targeted appropriate. We know you're good at targeting because we've witnessed targeting in the past. When you passed your tax cut under the same process, and I hope people are listening in now all across the country to understand the difference between the two parties. When you targeted a population, you do so very skillfully, including when you passed your massive tax cut where there was no emergency whatsoever, no sense of urgency. 80% of that tax cut went to the nation's wealthiest 1%. By contrast, in dealing with a global pandemic that here in America has taken over 465,000 lives of your fellow citizens. You sit there and still have not come forward with any plan whatsoever, but you want to limit the unemployment that people who have been out of work and suffering receive. You're not sure, and we're in denial for almost half a year as to whether or not this was even a serious disease. This is what I think confounds the American people. I'm proud of this legislation, even prouder so that President Biden has indicated that this is a rescue plan for America. Chairman Neal has laid out what it does in terms of the benefits that it will provide. And Chairman Powell, I thought, did a great job also from the Fed of recognizing that now is the time for us to go big. I'm glad that even with the torpedoes and the salvos and all the shots that are being fired at President Biden today, that he has said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Let's get the relief to the American people that they richly deserve. People in my district, and I'll submit for the record, countless letters that people have found themselves out of employment through no fault of their own, caring for their children, wondering about how they're going to educate them in college, seniors who have only Social Security and wondering what they're going to do to get by. And so this money that we're extending and putting forward is necessary and needed, and it's urgent. We get no plan for the other side. We just get platitudes and a lecture on what they think we're doing wrong. How about you roll up your sleeves and do something on behalf of the American people and get them the relief that they need? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
And without objection, letters will be included in the official record. Let me recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, to strike the last word. Mr. Schweikert, would you please unmute?
Always helps when you take yourself off mute.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Brady. To my friend from Connecticut, when we make public policy, I think we all have an obligation to get the facts correct on the math. This year, tax reform, that top 1% will get somewhere in the mid-20s percent of the benefit, not in the 80s. I know that's a rhetorical talking point that's said over and over, but let's get to the point. The section of this legislation we're talking about right now is the unemployment benefits. How many on this, this call, when you talk to your staff at home, much of the casework they're doing is trying to help our constituents get that unemployment check? Have you actually picked up the phone and called your state agencies and understood why they're having such great difficulties? They're buried. But one of the things they're buried with is fraud. Here's a picture from, and I'll openly disclose, my wife's business. This is one day. Those are envelopes for unemployment claims, except they're for people who've never worked at my wife's business. They've now had more unemployment claims than they actually have employees. And as of yesterday, she received an envelope with her own name and her own Social Security asking for unemployment, showing the level of sophistication of the fraud. If we actually care about helping our constituents who are hurting, who are waiting, who are fighting through the bureaucracy to get this assistance, we need to step up and find a mechanism, whether it's a data match mechanism, and help the states do this to strip out the fraud claims, which are clogging up the system. It's just, I know we're uncomfortable talking about the fraud and the unemployment, but the scale of it is stunning. Think of all the calls you're getting at your office. Reach out to some of the small businesses in your community. The second thing, Mr. Chairman, I will beg of us to consider, Mr. Brady, I believe it was last year, had proposed the concept of sort of an off-ramp. Could you keep a small portion of the federal enhanced unemployment as you accept a job, so there's not sort of this sudden cliff? So as a committee, if we really care about our constituents who are really suffering out there, let's accomplish two things. Let's find a way to take on this massive scale of fraud that is very sophisticated and are using lots of, shall we say, stolen personal data. Take that on, and maybe that will make it so that these unemployment payments move through the system faster and smoother. And the second thing, Mr. Chairman, is would the majority here consider something like Mr. Brady's concepts of we're going to reward you by having you keep some of this enhanced benefit as you accept employment, therefore creating that incentive to do the transition. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, to strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A little over a year ago, the coronavirus first reached the United States. Since then, more than 27 million cases and more than 465,000 people have died. I hear some of my friends on the other side of the aisle disparage government-mandated shutdowns. Well, perhaps if the Trump administration had responded, not disparaging public health and targeting it, but embracing it aggressively, we could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps even 2 of our elected colleagues from dying from the coronavirus. I hear concerns about division and disruption. And this is from a party where 127 people were part of disputing the fair and fair democratic election and helped fuel the outrage that we saw on Capitol Hill. We have some people complaining about the process that we're doing and it's not targeted and focused enough. And I can't help comparing that with what happened when they did their reconciliation project. Targeted, focused, they had an opportunity to help American families who needed it the most. And instead, they ensured that the wealthy and the corporations would not be paying their fair share. They squandered $2.3 trillion to further enrich those who need it the less. They enacted a massive reduction in the corporate tax, provided 3/4 of the benefits to shareholders and ensuring that businesses had the cash to buy back their own stock. They passed a doubling of the estate and gift tax exemptions, essentially rendering those taxes meaningless for all but a tiny subset of the ultra wealthy. They had a generous pass-through deduction for pass-through entities that disproportionately benefited the wealthy. They cut the top rate for individual taxpayers. They were just plain reckless in some points. They passed provisions that would have made agricultural co-ops practice essentially tax-free farming, and they would have severely damaged the wind energy industry before we shamed them into withdrawing it. This legislation, instead of enriching the well-off, we want to help the neediest individuals with economic supports that they need to get through the pandemic safely. It provides a lifeline for unemployment workers by extending pandemic unemployment benefits and increasing the weekly $400 benefit through September. This is how you benefit Main Street business. You give Americans money to pay their bills, to shop and live. It provides an economic lifeline for individuals and working families through another round of stimulus checks, something that I personally fought hard to secure in this package and hope that we can continue to provide through the duration of the pandemic. And unlike the Republican tax bill, I would point out their tax decrease, their tax cut was less popular than Bill Clinton's tax increase. We invest significantly in working families with extensions to the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the child and dependent care tax credit. These are supporting some of the most efficient anti-poverty programs offered by the federal government. And finally, as a point of personal privilege, I'm pleased that the chairman and the committee have supported my Restaurants Act by giving proper tax treatment for my legislation that provided $25 billion for the restaurant industry, the hardest hit sector of the economy. This is another way that we help Main Street America by providing essential assistance for restaurants that are the cornerstone of our neighborhoods. This budget reconciliation is a chance to atone for a year of missed opportunity, of upset, of changing the subject and dodging responsibility. And I am pleased that President Biden, with the help of this committee, will be able to follow through. I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, to strike the last word.
Good afternoon or good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Obviously, deeply disturbed by this bill, the nature of the bill, the substance of it, and the process. Look, the American people are sick and tired of politicians telling them one thing and doing something different. I mean, Joe Biden, our president, and Democrat leadership promised a new era of unity and bipartisanship. We haven't seen anything of the like. I mean, I can appreciate a difference of opinion and a philosophical difference between my colleagues, but to say one thing and do another, a deluge of unilateral executive actions that have destroyed the livelihoods of people like the ones in my backyard in the oil patch, who are working families, and their hopes and dreams have been shattered because President Biden said, "You're fired." He just said, "You're fired." We're trying to keep people in the game. We're trying to help them back onto their feet. We're trying to give them hope. And at the same time, out of one side of your mouth, we're saying this, and another side of our mouths, we're destroying people's livelihood and their quality of life. They're in a bad place. And on top of that, you've got a partisan impeachment that's going nowhere. I think it's unconstitutional. There's been no crime. It's silliness. It's backwards looking. It's petty. It's punitive. I could go on, but the fact is, it's not unity. It's not working together to solve America's problems and to help our fellow countrymen and our country move forward. And this now partisan COVID ram and jam bailout and series of bad policies and barriers to going back to work is horrible. There's some good things buried in this, but for the most part, it's not good for the country. Like I said, to bail out union pensions and to bail out cities and states for their reckless and irresponsible behavior prior to COVID with no expectation of reforms, with no accountability, that is shameful. As stewards and fiduciaries of taxpayers, to call this COVID relief, to wrap that flag around these bailouts is, I'm just so disappointed. On top of that, we're instead of incentivizing and rewarding people for going back to work and opening up our economy and opening up our schools for our kids, we're paying people more to stay on unemployment. We're talking about leisure and hospitality and the service industry and how they're having a hard time. Well, of course they are. We've given people the rational decision to stay home and make more money than to go to work. We're putting more cash in the hands of people on the child tax credit for staying home and giving them more cash per child. And the lower the income and the less the work, the more they get paid. I mean, I feel like that, that whole saying, the 80s called and they want their welfare program back. I mean, we want to help people. And my colleagues know that we're willing to, because we passed $4 trillion in 6 COVID-related packages on a bipartisan basis. We did that. We were wanting to do it for months, but Speaker Pelosi didn't want to work with President Trump. So she'd rather him lose than the country win. We waited. But we've done this on a bipartisan basis, and we've targeted those in need, and we've put responsible measures in place that would incentivize the right behavior to get this country back. And this is nothing of the sort today, nothing of the sort. And anyway, I'm not going to go on and continue to rail against it. I have tremendous respect for my chairman and for my colleagues. This is horrible policy. This is a Trojan horse for things that are unrelated to COVID. There are some good things, and there's some things that are overpriced that we could work on, we could hone. But I remember getting lectured to my first term on Ways and Means from folks about what we did on Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and the process. And anyway, I hope none of us do that. We should stop lecturing each other about process. But I just want to get the policies right for my country, and this is not the right path. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, after listening to that diatribe, I cannot believe we're at this point. Now, we are against unity. How could you be for unity and be in support of an impeachment process? That question is as empty as the rhetoric I've heard this morning. Look, I want to move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence.
The gentleman is recognized.
Today's markup is an important step in our fight against COVID-19 and towards and forward to recovery. I've heard the word taxpayers used so many times this morning that you would think that you invented the word, the other side. Taxpayers, over and over again, yet just the opposite happened in the tax legislation that we passed in 2017. Just the opposite. And the proof of the pudding was the elections of 2018. If you decrease taxes that much, and when the constituency turns against you, both Democrats and Republicans, you know that you've gone over the line and people don't believe you. Let's give this president, this is only the beginning of the third week he's been president of the United States. Give him a chance. Give him a chance. Because he's worth the chance. I think he's leveled with us so far. He has talked to Republicans. Maybe he didn't talk to you, but he's talked to Republicans both in the House and the Senate. Now, you're entitled to your opinions. That's called liberty. On day one, President Biden restored science-based public health decisions to support Americans in need. If we're not going to turn the economy around until we get ahead of the virus, that means we need to have science-based decisions. Hip, hip, hooray. But only Congress can do the heaviest lifting for our nation. Only Congress. We are trying to restore the integrity of this institution, one of the three branches of government. We're trying to do that. It's up to us to ensure the millions of Americans that are struggling to find work. Most people would rather work, but you have never given credit to those people who have to work hard, must work hard, and love their country, just like you, just like myself. We got to do the heavy lifting here. They want to put, these people want to pay their rents. They want to put food on the table. That's important, and you would agree with that. So it's up to us to protect seniors living in nursing homes. Don't you think? By providing real resources for strike teams to crush COVID-19. It's up to us to ensure every American has access to quality, affordable health insurance, especially for unemployed workers who have lost their coverage and sick leave to get vaccinated. So what we do if we didn't have the Affordable Care Act, think about it. Think about it. And I think part of this legislation goes to extending the ability to open it up to our citizens to get into the Affordable Care Act position. They still haven't come up with an alternative health plan. Where would we be without the ACA right now? Instead of 60,000 people who have died, what would we do? These are Congress's burdens. It's our committee's burden. Providing a new round of you would think at the end of this discussion that we support fraud, and we don't support fraud. And you've said it over and over again. Don't you talk to me about fraud after we've had 4 years of fraud. We need it in New Jersey. We need it all over.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I better yield right now, Mr.
Good,
Chair.
thank you. I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, to strike the last word.
Frustration.
Thank you.
$1,400 for qualifying individuals will make millions of people feel much more secure and relieved, as will the corona vaccine. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I speak in strong favor of the legislative package before us today. My wife is in favor of it. My children are in favor of it. My neighbors are in favor of it. My mayor is in favor of it. My pastor is in favor of it. My governor is in favor of it. People all over Illinois are in favor of it. And people all over America are in favor of it. More than 70% have said they are. They are in favor. We are in favor because it is exactly what we need and goes a long way towards helping to arrest the COVID-19 virus and get America back on solid footing towards rebuilding and restoring economic viability and security. A $1.9 trillion investment will bring tremendous relief from continued spread of the coronavirus and help put economic restoration and stability in a good place. $941 billion of that is within jurisdiction of this committee, the Ways and Means Committee. And let's take a look at some of what it does. Crisis support for unemployed workers. My goodness, who could be against that? Emergency assistance to families through home visiting. Who would deny support to a young mother needing to know how to properly use a diaper for her baby? Emergency assistance to families with children. Child care for workers with children. Millions of people cannot go to work unless they know that their children are safe, secure, and being adequately cared for. Pensions are part of the security and protection we need as we grow older and retire from the world of work. Therefore, inclusion of the Butch-Lewis Emergency Pension Plan Act of 2021 would be a lifesaver for troubled pension plans and give assurances to thousands of retirees that their pension is safe and secure. Nothing is more helpful to an unemployed person as unemployment benefits but a job. So I want to commend Representative Horsford for his outstanding work on this issue. Extending unemployment benefits from March to the end of August is like manna from heaven. $400 a week will not make you rich, but it can help keep the wolf from knocking at your door. Mr. Chairman, in Illinois right now, the temperature is 10. Thousands of people don't have any heat in their homes because they were not able earlier to pay their electric and gas bills. $400 is going to help them to be able to get the heat on. It's going to help them to be able to prevent their landlord from hassling them about eviction. The Congressional Budget Office found that Black workers, for example, were disproportionately receiving unemployment benefits when congressional Republicans forced a cutoff of supplemental unemployment benefits last August, and likely to be harmed. And that would likely be the case now. Yes, we could go on and on and on, and I am amazed at some of what I have heard this morning. We know that if you don't work, you can't get unemployment benefits. You can't just walk up to the place and say, I've never had a job, I don't work, but give me some benefits. So let's be real, let's be honest, and let's be true. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I want to start out by saying, we say that we need to hold these meetings remotely to protect ourselves and our staff, but in truth, members of Congress have been offered the vaccination. I think most of them have completed the vaccination, and their staff we've been offered vaccinations for at least 2 of our staff members. So I really don't understand the reason we can't hold these hearings live. We've been handed on this particular section, the parts that we have jurisdiction over in this massive $1.9 trillion bill. This bill only, I guess, at night, the night before last, with no time to prepare. And I think even still some parts of the bill are being drafted, perhaps those that aren't under our jurisdiction. So I think this hearing is really a mockery. There's been absolutely no hearings on this whatsoever. I know that Senate Republicans, as opposed to what has been said earlier, had offered an alternative solution, and the president decided that they would jam through this massive $1.9 trillion partial COVID assistance, partial liberal wish list, partial state bailout, and so forth. It is a ham-handed way to to add to our deficit, and it's anything but targeted. It will result in massive amounts of fraud and massive amounts of waste. And it will actually, the really tragic part about all that is that in addition to having this massive increase in our deficit, it will also increase unemployment. It'll cost 1.4 trillion jobs. 1.4 million jobs. So it is a terribly designed bill. I truly do wish that there was real legislative dialogue here, and that we would sit down and work as a committee to do this work instead of simply ceding our authority to the administration, which unfortunately both parties have done in the past. And one of the reasons why folks in America are so very frustrated with Congress, because we routinely cede our authority to the legislature and then just simply rubber stamp what they come up with. It is unfortunate. We are not doing our jobs. We should be there in Washington, holding hearings on this, not just going straight to a markup on this massive bill that we only saw a day and a half ago, that probably nobody on this dais has read. And it's a terrible shame. We will go through this process for the next 2 days. And in the end, probably every Democrat will vote for it and every Republican will vote against it. And really, honestly, none of us have had the level of input and discussion and understanding of this bill that we should have had on any remedial bill, much less a massive $1.9 trillion bill that will actually cost 1.4 million jobs. It's so insane that you can hardly even make it up. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and the gentleman should know I would much prefer that we do this in person. I would be delighted if the House attending physician made that recommendation. I built a career on those sorts of contacts. I would much prefer that we be here. I think we all agree that this is an awkward way to proceed. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to thank you for bringing this incredibly important package forward. We are just a month out from the anniversary of the stay-at-home orders that turned our way of life completely upside down. We've lost countless friends, family members, and neighbors, and millions more are at the very end of their rope. Our country is resilient, and the American people are resilient, but they cannot do this alone. The only way that we can get through this pandemic is to not leave anyone behind. And that's why this package is scaled to deal with the enormous challenge that we face. It will extend enhanced unemployment benefits so that families can meet their basic needs while finally getting this pandemic under control. It will get badly needed financial assistance to working families and those who've been left behind by the previous COVID relief efforts, because not everybody was included in those efforts. And it addresses the long-term needs of working families to get back on their feet by ensuring that basic necessities like childcare and healthcare are within reach. I'm particularly proud that this package includes an expansion and improvement of the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit that I have long championed. And I'm also pleased that this package contains a bill that I've introduced with Congresswoman McBath of Georgia. Our bill would support those receiving unemployment insurance by providing a guaranteed subsidy for coverage in the ACA marketplaces. This section would help those who are at disproportionate risk of contracting and dying from COVID by connecting them and their families with health care. A Families USA report found that nearly 4 million workers between the end of November of last year to the end of January had no health insurance and relied on unemployment benefits to make ends meet. Nearly half of these hardworking Americans are people of color. A third of these workers report not having enough to eat. Half have little confidence that they can afford next month's rent or mortgage. These individuals now qualify for advanced premium tax credits under this provision. Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert the Families USA report into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. We are in a public health and economic crisis. We cannot afford to have millions of people uninsured. We have to stop making people choose between keeping a roof over their head or having health insurance. This is not the time to delay or play games. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to deny the problems that are rampant in this country, and they want to duck responsibility for fixing them. People in this country need our help, and any attempt to delay is a threat to the communities that we are elected to represent. It's a threat to the frontline workers that we praise. It's a threat to the millions of individuals who've already lost so much. President Biden is doing exactly what he said he would do. He's getting desperately needed assistance to people who need it and leading the charge to crush the virus, unlike the previous occupant of the White House who denied its existence. And if you want to wonder why we can't have in-person committee markups, it's because still many of my Republican colleagues refuse to wear masks in the hallways and in committee rooms and on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, despite clear evidence that they help stop the spread. And I would add that not every member has been vaccinated. And I would add that even if you are vaccinated, there is a small risk that you can get the COVID-19 virus and pass it on to family members and loved ones. So until such time as this virus is crushed, no, we can't have in-person committee meetings. It would have happened a lot sooner if my Republican colleagues would have heeded the advice of the House physician and would have followed those recommendations. I want to thank the chairman for his courage and for helping us put together a package that is really going to address the very real needs of the people that we represent. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Mr. Chairman, over the past year, our country has faced a harrowing, unprecedented crisis. The coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent economic fallout have reverberated throughout our entire society, jeopardizing the health and financial stability of millions of American families. In Alabama, my home state, over 8,500 people have died of COVID-19, and over 500,000 workers have already applied for unemployment benefits. We know the effects of this pandemic have disproportionately impacted communities of color and low-income workers who are more likely to be frontline workers and less likely to have access to affordable quality health care. We are making progress to disseminate vaccinations, but we must do so equitably to make sure that we stop the spread of COVID-19. It is clear that we must continue to provide robust support for working families that last through the duration of this pandemic, especially those who have been hardest hit. And the Biden American Rescue Plan before us today is simply an important step towards this goal. This legislation includes many of the most important policies that can address both the health and economic challenges that lie ahead. We have an obligation to the American people, Mr. Chairman, and we must ensure that everything is being done to protect individuals and their families by providing affordable quality health care coverage during the worst pandemic, the worst public health crisis that we've ever experienced. That's why I support this legislation and its efforts to help Americans access health care by enhancing the advanced premium tax credit that have helped millions of Americans purchase coverage in the ACA. This is a critically important change, considering that over 80% of the marketplace enrollees receive advanced premium tax credits to help them afford the cost of insurance coverage. In addition, this bill would also make very important changes and improvements to the ACA by removing the subsidy cliff at 400% of the federal poverty level. The extension and expansion of federal unemployment benefits in this bill will provide financial stability for these workers until they are able to safely re-enter the workplace. $400 a week, Mr. Chairman, will not make you rich, but it could help you get by. This legislation also includes an additional $7.6 million in child care funding for the state of Alabama alone, which will help our frontline and hourly workers who are some of the most heroic frontline workers that we have during this pandemic. This legislation would also include life-saving and life-changing expansions to the child tax credit and earned income tax credit that I have championed for years. In my district, 53% of the children, that's over half of the children, do not receive the full benefits of the child tax credit because it is not fully refundable. By expanding the benefit amount and making it fully refundable, we will dramatically reduce child poverty, and we will make a significant difference to low-income families. Mr. Chairman, while we want to work with our Republican colleagues to deliver these significant resources to the American people, we simply cannot wait any longer. A raging global pandemic that has killed more than 465,000 Americans and disproportionately killed people of color means that waiting causes death to Americans. Waiting means that more Americans will lose their job and leave those that are unemployed unable to make rent, to feed their children, or to purchase life-saving medicines. To my GOP colleagues, I simply say that my constituents cannot wait any longer. They elected President Biden because he promised that help was on the way. And this American Rescue Plan does just that, provides life-saving COVID relief to Americans. Each of these policies is critical to tackling the pandemic and rebuilding an economy that works for all. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I am reminded that during this Black History Month, the powerful words of Dr. Martin Luther King ring true. He said in a letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Perhaps it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. There comes a time when the cup of endureth runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." Mr. Chairman, indeed, there is a fierce urgency of now. Dr. King adds, "Time itself is neutral. It can either be used destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that people of ill will will use time more efficiently than people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but the appalling silence of good people. Human progress never rolls.
The gentlelady's
in the
time has
puddles of
expired.
inevitability. Rather, it comes because we are willing to do something about it. My colleagues, the time is ripe and the time is right to pass President Biden's rescue plan, and we must do so now. We simply cannot wait.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
When the spread of COVID-19 prompted our country to shut down nearly a year ago, we knew that we were facing a public health crisis that would impact our lives in a way this nation has never known. We are at war not with a human adversary, but with a highly contagious and lethal virus. So when we shut down, this pandemic forever changed our lives. In my community of Buffalo and Western New York, schools closed, workplaces went remote. Entire sectors of our economy, hotels, restaurants, retailers had their business plans decimated in an instant. Local governments struggled to keep up with the need to test and to trace. Hospitals became COVID wards as nurses and doctors struggled to protect their patients and themselves from this dangerous disease. And it caused an economic crisis because in order to keep us safe from the disease, we had to change. What is clear from how we responded to this pandemic is for the first few months, we weren't ready for it. The federal government response was best characterized as slow, sloppy, and chaotic. This chaos has made an impact on the pandemic and the turmoil specifically caused on Black communities throughout this nation. The role of Congress and the federal government in times of national emergency is to marshal its resources to ensure that states and localities have the resources to respond on the ground, whether it's a snowstorm, a blizzard, a flooding, hurricane, or forest fires. The federal government's role in times of national emergency is to do one thing: protect its people. But this response did not work for the first 11 months. This plan that's put forth, that's being dealt with by this committee and the leadership of our president, is to do big things fast, to get real people, real help in ways that they actually feel and experience. It's simple, it's straightforward. It will deal with the disease and also deal with the economic damage that has been done to this economy. We should move, and we should move fast. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Del Bene, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you and the staff for all of the work that you've done to prepare this very critical legislation. 1 year and 21 days ago, the CDC confirmed the first case of COVID-19 in the United States. That first case was in Snohomish County, Washington, the region that I represent. That man was fortunate enough to have survived, but nearly 5,000 Washingtonians have not been so lucky. Mr. Chairman, it's been a long and tiring journey for my constituents, and I'm pleased that we're moving this week's legislation to provide greater relief to the families and workers who've been hit so hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Washington State has a 7.1% unemployment rate, meaningfully higher than the national average. And Congress must act swiftly and decisively. And that's why I'm so pleased to see robust benefits for unemployed workers in the Ways and Means package. This dual economic and public health crisis is unprecedented, and only unprecedented action will meet the moment, a moment that's lasted over a year for my constituents. I'm pleased to see the longest extension of emergency UI provisions since the CARES Act in this bill. This will provide several months of vital unemployment insurance support and give workers and states greater certainty. This provision is critical for my district, which has been dealing with the economic fallout from the public health emergency longer than anywhere else in the country. I'm also pleased to see additional relief for nonprofits, a provision that I led with my colleague from Illinois, Representative Sean Casten. Our provision increases the vital federal reimbursement to cover unemployment costs for nonprofits from 50% to 75%. At a time when nonprofits are responding to more demand than ever from their communities, but with fewer resources, it's common sense for the federal government to step up and provide assistance. For example, the Washington State YMCAs have spent $6 million on UI costs, all while increasing services to accommodate increased demand from school closures. Washington Ys have stepped up to provide full-time childcare for first responders and other essential workers during school closures. Childcare is critical so parents can return to work and our economy works again. This relief is sorely needed, and I want to thank Chairman Neal and Morna Miller from the Worker and Family Assistance Subcommittee for helping to make sure this fix was included. This will be the second extension of UI benefits, and I'm concerned that if the economy is not vastly improved by the end of August, an additional extension could be warranted. My colleague, Mr. Beyer, with the backing of the New Democrat Coalition, which I chair, has been pushing for automatic stabilizers, which would deploy enhanced UI benefits based on economic metrics, like the unemployment rate. I know that once we defeat the coronavirus, we'll be on a good footing to get our economy back on track, as long as a premature discontinuation of benefits is prevented. A UI system that includes automatic stabilizers would provide workers and states a level of certainty that we can't guarantee under our current program. I look forward to continuing that conversation and working with my colleagues to modernize our UI system. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all of the Ways and Means Committee staff for your tireless work on the American Rescue Plan. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Today is such a significant day. It is a day that we advance a significant portion of President Biden's American Rescue Plan, which will relieve the suffering of the American people. It will help to defeat the coronavirus and get our economy back to work. We must do everything to ensure that we can ease the financial suffering of American workers and families and empower our health systems with the resources they need to defeat the public health crisis before us. First, this bill provides another round of survival checks at $1,400 per person under the same income thresholds as the CARES Act. I call them survival checks because it is the most flexible funding we can send to families while they wait on unemployment assistance, rental assistance, nutrition assistance, and other federal programs that will meet their needs during this pandemic. I'm proud that this bill expands the stimulus check so that 2.2 million American children with Social Security numbers born to immigrant parents are now eligible for these payments. This bill ensures that joint filers with mixed immigration status are not discriminated against solely because of their mixed status. And after being left out of previous iterations, this bill includes stimulus payments for older children and adult dependents. The bill also does so much to provide additional assistance to families. We know that women are dropping out of the workforce during this pandemic at historic and alarming rates, and we need to do something to help. The expansion for the child tax credit means that families will get increased tax credits per child, and because the credit is fully refundable and paid out on a monthly basis, it will help lower income families struggling to stay afloat with everyday expenses during the pandemic. Coupled with the expansions to the child and dependent care tax credit, it means that families will be able to recoup more of their hard-earned money spent on child and dependent care, including for essential low-wage workers who still require dependent care while they worked away from their homes during the pandemic. I also strongly support the unemployment provisions in this bill. I represent a district in Los Angeles County where many individuals who are unable to work are gig workers or independent contractors in the entertainment industry who, like other workers in the country, lost jobs and contracts due to the pandemic. These workers do not normally qualify for unemployment benefits from their states, but so many of them had their entire income wiped away overnight. So I'm thrilled that this bill extends a provision I worked hard to include in the CARES Act that makes these workers eligible for benefits through a federal program. And critically, this bill also includes relief for mixed income workers who had income from both salary jobs and independent contracting work. These workers were unfortunately limited to receiving only state benefits based on their W-2s, which did not reflect their larger true earned income. So I fought to allow mixed earners to receive an additional $100 benefit per week to ensure they are receiving a benefit based on their actual earned income. And I'm pleased that this provision was included in our December relief bill and is extended in this package. No one should be penalized for having multiple jobs in order to pay their bills. This bill also recognizes that we need to make critical investments in our child care programs. The bill increased the child care entitlements to states from $2.9 billion to $3.4 billion permanently. As the pandemic has worn on, 2.3 million women have left the workforce, and millions of parents are reaching a breaking point in balancing their jobs with their caretaking responsibilities. This money will help child care centers reopen and provide assistance to families struggling to pay for child care. And finally, the bill makes significant investments in making health coverage more affordable by enhancing the advanced premium tax credit for ACA plans, providing COBRA coverage, and ensuring that those who receive unemployment insurance have access to a guaranteed, robust subsidy for an ACA plan. It provides critical investments in our nursing homes to keep our seniors safe and healthy. I want to thank the chairman for bringing up this essential bill before us today. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, to strike the last word.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You know, our struggle with COVID-19 remains very real. And that's why it's important that our committee and this Congress be committed to taking strong action and doing so very quickly. So I just want to mention how proud I am that we have made input into this bill of $941 billion, and our reach far extends our jurisdiction to help deliver relief to families, businesses, our communities that are under siege by all of these fronts. That respond, and our response needs to be adequate. You know, now is not the time for half measures, as very few are arguing. We have had economists on both sides of the aisles say that this is not a time to do anything small. We need a bold response, and the measure before us puts us on that path. You know, during our committee markup today, we have the opportunity to help the least, the lost, and the often overlooked. Critically, this bill we're marking up includes another round of economic impact payments, greater health care coverage subsidies for those who've lost their jobs, enhanced child care assistance, refundable tax credit expansions, and extended supplemental unemployment benefits. And today we're making clear that all Americans, and not just the top 1%, are the well-off can make it through these trying and turbulent times. Our economy is just stuck in a ditch, And today we're making a comprehensive approach to help get individuals and families out. And we're directly tackling child poverty. I'm just so grateful to all my colleagues on this committee who have stuck with this issue because really our children are the canary in the coal mine. If you see hungry children, like the 1 in 4 kids in Wisconsin were food insecure before COVID, I dare not even query about what it is now. I can tell you, though, those numbers have not gotten any better during this pandemic. And not just in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but it's thrown millions of Americans out of work and into food insecurity and facing eviction. And I'm so proud of the measures we voted on that will help our most vulnerable populations meet their fundamental needs. With this bill, we're taking steps to address long-term inequities in our country that go beyond our jurisdiction. Let's be clear, COVID has highlighted and shown us about the inequities in our country. I mean, no, COVID-19 is not racist, but it certainly has elucidated the structural racism in our country, and that not all boats are being lifted evenly. And it's no surprise that the populations disproportionately impacted by the virus and deaths are already disproportionately impacted by income inequality, criminal justice inequities, health inequities, and on and on and on. And according to the COVID racial data tracker nationally, Black people have died at 1.5 times the rate of white people. And this is the case even though non-Hispanic white people represent the largest racial group and most of the top 20 counties in our country with the highest COVID infection rates per capita. We're dying. This virus has hit communities of color particularly hard, not only in terms of infections and deaths, but economically. People from some racial and ethnic minority groups are disproportionately represented in essential work settings, such as healthcare facilities, farms, factories, grocery stores, and public transportation. And those who work in these settings have more chances to be exposed to the virus, take it home to their families, who are often multi-generational, and they have close contact with the public, and they're workers. These are workers who cannot zoom in to their jobs from home, and they don't have paid sick leave, which this bill addresses. We have a continuing responsibility to help people who are making such great sacrifices. Who knew they were essential workers before this pandemic? Or help them throughout this pandemic and beyond. We must not forget that those hit hardest now will struggle the most to overcome the added challenge of this pandemic, compounding the obstacles for our most vulnerable that we face. You know, even with vaccine distribution, communities of color are lagging. According to my paper, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, in Milwaukee County, I hear the gavel, and so I will honor the gavel. I'll just want to mention that the vaccine is not getting out. I know that that's not our jurisdiction. It's not a perfect bill, but trust me, there are areas I would love to further strengthen, but I have never voted on a perfect bill, but as an elected official, but this comes pretty doggone close. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for her comments. Let me recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I would like first to start by congratulating you and our great staff on this bold vision for helping America during this coronavirus pandemic. Our families, seniors, small businesses are all struggling from this dual health and economic crisis posed by COVID-19. My district has been hit really hard. Nearly 50,000 constituents have contracted COVID-19, and nearly 1,600 of my constituents have tragically lost their lives due to this virus. People I know, friends of mine, friends of all of us, one of our own members in this House has lost their lives to this terrible, terrible pandemic. Just this week, a mother in my district, Sandy,
wrote to me with their heartbreaking story. Sandy tragically lost her husband and her son within 3 days of each other due to COVID-19. So many people in our community have lost family, friends, and neighbors. So for Sandy and so many others impacted by this terrible disease, we must act now to provide additional relief. So I'm really proud of the work that the Ways and Means Committee has done to provide real, immediate relief for families. And it's really important as we talk about this legislation to realize we have to scale the response to the size and the scope of this problem. And there's not any part of our lives that have not been affected by this. With this bill, for example, we finished the job to ensure that families receive $2,000 direct payments to help them pay bills and provide for their families. And to create, importantly, to create demand in the economy, which is good for those families, but also good for the small businesses that they will support with those ready to spend dollars. With this bill, we also expand the child care and earned income tax credits, building on legislation that I introduced with my colleague, Congressman Evans. Expanding these tax credits for families will help thousands of families in our district, lifting them out of poverty. Because of this bill, families will not have to wait for relief from the child tax credit until they file their taxes. Instead, they'll have recurring payments coming to them to support those families. Right now, our unemployment rate in my home state of Michigan is at 7.5%. For 2 months in a row, unemployment in this state has increased. Thousands of Michiganders are still out of work because of this virus. They need help. And that's why I've helped lead the fight to extend unemployment insurance benefits. And I'm particularly grateful for the work of my colleague, Mr. Horsford, on this front. With this bill, we expand the pandemic unemployment compensation, a supplemental federal benefit, to $400 a week through August. And let me just say this, because I've heard some of my colleagues on the other side comment on this. The notion that the unemployment benefit creates an incentive for people to sit on the sidelines and stay out of the workplace ignores some key facts. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a study by 2 professors at Yale University that show with good data that the unemployment benefit does not cause employers to lay people off and does not prevent workers from coming back. It's an important study, and with your permission, with unanimous consent, I'd like to have that study submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Secondly, it's important to keep in mind that you can't get unemployment by quitting your job. And you can't get unemployment if you're offered an opportunity to come back to work. But having said all of that, I'm tired of hearing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle insult the workers that I represent and workers across this country by implying that an American worker would rather sit at home than participate in the workforce and have the dignity and meaning that comes with a job. I don't need a study to tell me that that people in this country would rather find meaningful employment. So I know you can find some anecdote or some story about somebody who preferred to stay home, but I will tell you this: where I live, the people I represent would stand in long lines for a job, for the dignity that comes with work. So I'm just a little worn out on this continuing insult to the great American worker by suggesting that they really don't want to work. That's not the people I know. So not just workers, but seniors have been hurt by this pandemic. It's important that we realize that under Mr. Neal's leadership, Democrats are committed to helping those folks as well. With this legislation, we passed the Butch-Lewis Act to ensure that retirees will have their full pension benefits that they have earned. And finally, the health provisions in this bill help make sure that people get the additional relief to ensure that their insurance premiums are affordable and they can continue to access health care in a meaningful way. It also includes legislation.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly suggest my colleagues support this legislation. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, to strike the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to extend my appreciation to our wonderful staff. Mr. Chairman, this is the most difficult and most important moment in our economy in a dozen years since the spring of 2009. And it is one of the two most difficult and tenuous moments in our economic history since the 1930s. It's striking the differences, though, today versus 12 years ago. 12 years ago, when President Obama and a Democratic Congress pushed forward with a robust stimulus plan, one that saved the economy and led to the largest economic expansion in American history. But when they did so, it was incredibly divisive in the sense that so many Americans, unfortunately, were not supportive of it. It was controversial. But fortunately, they had the foresight to press forward. How different it is today. A recent Reuters poll showed that unlike 12 years ago, 90% of economists polled support the statement, quote, this 1.9 trillion stimulus bill will significantly boost the economy. Even President Trump's former economist, Kevin Hassett, has come out in favor of this stimulus plan. And it's not just economists from across the ideological spectrum, it's a large majority of the American people. 3 recent opinion polls from Pew Research, Quinnipiac, and CBS News all found the same thing. The vast majority of the American people support this bill. A majority of Democrats, a majority of independents, and even a majority of Republicans. So this bill is bipartisan. I just hope the Republicans elected and serving on Capitol Hill will follow what Republicans around the country want with respect to the stimulus bill. And there is no question that it is badly needed. One of the reasons why Kevin Hassett said that this was needed because of the enormous risk of slipping into a double-dip recession. We have seen in recent months, really over the last 6 to 7 weeks, the spike in COVID cases and COVID deaths. We continue to have approximately 20% of the COVID cases worldwide and 20% of the COVID deaths, even though we're only 4% of the world's population. So, Mr. Chairman, I, for one, feel quite grateful that we have a president who is willing to lead in a large and robust way, recognizing what the vast majority of economists and vast majority of American people recognize, that this is not a time for shrinking. This is a time to go big and a time to be bold. I am proud to support this president and my Democratic colleagues on this committee in this effort. And I hope that a number of my Republican colleagues will do what the vast majority of the American people are asking them to do, and to join us the same way congressional Democrats, time and time again, joined our Republican colleagues last year, even though there was a Republican in the White House. We did the right thing then. I hope they do the right thing now. Our economy desperately needs it. With this bill and with leadership from the White House, we will be able to get through this pandemic, God willing. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for introducing this critical legislation and commend our colleagues who champion this key relief provisions for benefit struggling American families. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for meeting the moment, because of your leadership, we will have the opportunity to move America forward. My constituents, countless households across the U.S. are really hurting. The communities are representative and have experienced serious financial hardships and deserve a bigger and bolder federal response to meet the scale that these terrible health and economic crises are bringing. We have a responsibility to quickly deliver relief to help our district neighbors around towards the economic recovery. The bill supports middle and low-income households by providing additional $1,400 economic impact payments. To finish the job on the $2,000 check, expanding child tax credit and expanding earned income credit. I have learned from many constituents who support this committee's stimulus package. One wrote that these payments are necessary to prevent millions of Americans from going to being homeless, not able to pay their bills, and going hungry. Do the right thing. Do what's needed to be done. Millions of people are counting on you. My constituents are right. Millions are losing their jobs in this terrible wake of this pandemic. Many of our Americans, primarily women, have been forced to leave the workforce due to the burden of child care and other child care responsibilities. Many households are experiencing food insecurity and struggling to meet their rent and mortgage obligation. For too many Americans, they have fallen into this poverty and are now at risk of eviction and potential homelessness, and are having trouble putting food on the table. I strongly support expanding the child tax credit and the expanded income tax credit because these are two tools that are poverty busters. This act would increase the credit for all children and would help make the credit fully refundable for the first time, benefiting hundreds and low-income people. It would also expand the earned income tax credit for childless workers by nearly tripling the maximum credit and extending eligibility. We cannot deny this tax relief for families in need. The cost of inaction is far too great and would harm those who need most of them. These big and bold steps are the first path towards to relief and economic rescue. We are new leadership in the White House, in the Senate. I look forward to widening use of these tax credits to help reduce Philadelphia's high poverty rate and lift its working families across the U.S. In addition to economic crisis, communities are experiencing a health crisis. The pandemic has made devastating to all Americans, but for all communities of color, hardest hit Black, Latino communities are 1.7 times more to be contacted this dreadful virus than white Americans. Even more disturbing, Black and Latino Americans are 2.8 times more likely to die of COVID-19. To help control the spread of this virus, especially in communities of color, we need more viruses. At the current rate, at my home in Philadelphia is receiving vaccine. It needs to take action now. I'm stressing that because that's important. In addition, teachers across the country have been ordered to return to schools, yet they are not being prioritized for the vaccine. Many teachers in my district are worried. One constituent teacher told me, "We wonder if one death of a Philadelphia teacher, student, family members, and school transition is worth the risk of operating school buildings because of the lack of vaccine." These constituents' concerns are the reason I support this strongly. It is important $80 billion in full reconciliation to speed up. I stress, Mr. Chairman, in closing, cutting this health crisis requires increased vaccines, expand vaccine education, outreach. It is important that we work together, and your leadership with all of us will help solve this. I thank you for what you're doing, and it's important that we join together and get this done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Today is a historic day in our committee. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to challenge our public health, devastate our economy, and affect nearly every aspect of our society, the Ways and Means Committee is working with our colleagues across the House to craft legislation that meets the challenges this moment poses. First, the legislation continues critical economic assistance to Americans by extending unemployment insurance and issuing another round of economic impact payments. The direct assistance to American families and workers is literally a lifeline to the millions who are currently unemployed, and countless others facing reduced hours, increased expenses, and an uncertain year ahead. It is the difference between losing everything and feeding your family, keeping your home, and paying your bills. Second, the package bolsters our healthcare system at a time of great need. The ACA dramatically increased the number of insured Americans, but too many were still priced out of the market due to high premiums and higher deductibles. This gap has only grown as the pandemic has progressed, leaving more to pay for their care out of pocket, or worse, to forego it entirely. Democrats have prioritized strengthening the Affordable Care Act since its creation, and this package delivers on that promise. Because of the work of our committee, the work that we will do this week, low and middle income Americans will be able to purchase the insurance they so desperately need and justly deserve. Third, this legislation makes crucial investments to ensure workers have access to affordable child care, helping both their families and their employers. The pandemic has demonstrated the fundamental requirement for child care in order for parents to fully enter the workforce. Protecting equitable access to child care will be essential to our economic recovery and renewal. The long-term investments this legislation makes to the child care entitlement to states will help all workers, but especially women, and particularly women of color, ensure they can access our workforce. We must not let the pandemic set back an entire generation of workers or constrain our nation's economic potential due to a lack of child care. Similarly, this legislation significantly expands the child tax credit and the child independent care tax credit, both of which are key to reducing child poverty. By both supporting child care and making that care more affordable, the legislation in this bill represents a significant and timely investment in both our children and families and in our economic future. I am also pleased that the legislation before us includes a provision I have long championed to make state and local governments eligible for the paid leave tax credit they were initially excluded from last spring. State and local governments have been on the front lines of our fight against COVID and represent our first responders, public healthcare workers, public works employees, teachers, and many other services all of us rely on each and every day. They need additional assistance to continue to offer essential services throughout our communities. I want to thank the committee staff and your leadership, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this critical legislation to the fore. We must rise to the challenge of this historic moment and provide Americans the necessary resources to get through the pandemic. I also look forward to continuing the important work of this committee to deliver for the American people by repealing the punitive cap on the SALT deduction, passing a long overdue infrastructure package, tackling climate change, continuing to ensure Americans get the health care they need and that they are secure in their retirement. Thank you again, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a long year. We're all pretty weary from this ordeal that our country's been through. And it was early last year in the spring when my father-in-law died. He got the coronavirus. He was 92 years old. He died within 36 hours. I know families that have lost both their mother and father. We all know people that have gotten sick and died, and people that have lost their jobs. And, you know, we still continue to function in Congress. You know, we can work remotely and get our paychecks, and we're going forward. But think about how people are just suffering so much. People that want to go to work and can't go to work because their restaurant is no longer open, or their catering hall that they worked at no longer does the business it used to, or they work in some live entertainment venue or some hospitality industry and they just can't make it. This plan being presented by the president and the great work by you, Mr. Chairman, and our committee and the other committees is to look at this in a comprehensive way, because we recognize that the recovery, as so many economists have said, has been a K-shaped recovery. Some people, they're going up, up, up. They're doing great. Wall Street's doing great. Online retail is doing fantastic. Certain businesses in healthcare doing very well. Other businesses are just wiped out. They're on the bottom part of the K. They can't make it. 25% of the people that make under $40,000 a year are unemployed. I was really moved by some of the statistics you gave in the beginning, Mr. Chairman. 17% of Americans are utilizing the help of food banks. 1 in 6 people can't pay their rent. 25% of Americans know someone who's lost their job, and 25% of Americans are having trouble paying its bills. We finally are putting together a comprehensive plan to look at all the different aspects of this pandemic, both to address the healthcare issues, the vaccines, to look at the issues of state and local governments, to look at the industries that are particularly hard hit, and especially looking at those people who, through no fault of their own, are suffering in ways they have never suffered before. When I heard our colleague Danny Davis talk about the idea of it's 11 degrees in his state right now, and people can't pay for their heat because they lost their job. We have such an enormous obligation right now, similar to what Congressman Higgins talked about, where the federal government, we have this great and awesome responsibility and this great and awesome honor to try and help people facing some of the most desperate times they've ever faced. And we'll try and do it responsibly. And we'll try and look out for people that want to abuse their system. I've got reports in my local papers of some sophisticated Nigerian criminal ring that is trying to abuse the unemployment system. And we have to fight against people trying to game the system. There's no question about it. But we can't lose sight of those people that every day are freezing or going hungry or suffering in ways they've never suffered before through no fault of their own. Let's work together. Let's move forward. Let's move our country forward. Let's beat this pandemic, and let's try and get back to enjoying our lives again. But in the meanwhile, let's help each other. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Look, this rescue plan is needed now more than any other time during this pandemic. And I agree with my good friend, Mr. Swazi. It's an honor that we can play our part in the Ways and Means Committee by being a part of this rescue package. Now, I know that together we have passed and signed into law 5 major record-setting COVID bills of close to $4 trillion. Relief packages that have kept the economy afloat, kept the poverty rate flat, and put the unemployment rate below 10%. But it's clear, based on the stats that we've heard just in this morning alone, that more needs to be done, especially considering what leading epidemiologists are saying. Michael Osterholm, who I like to follow, he recently stated that when it comes to this pandemic, the darkest of dark hours are still to come. So even with as much as we have done, the disease has been winning the race. And it feels like we're constantly catching up. And as I've heard said, we're not taming this tiger, we're riding it. Now, yeah, we started off with some blunt force tools of shutting down and putting ourselves in the self-induced economic comas. We finally got around to testing, but there wasn't enough and they weren't timely. And we should be proud we developed vaccines in record times. But now that there are variants spreading like wildfires, we really are in a race between injections and infections. So I believe that we are in this race, though, because we did our job last year. See, with the previous administration, we were left with a disjointed, divisive, and disorganized strategy of what I call federally funded, state mandated, and locally executed. Now, in Congress, we did our job. We provided those funds. And like I said, it kept us afloat and it kept us in the race. Yes, it added to the debt, but right now with interest rates and inflation low, that's what allows us to go big. It allows us to do what is needed on vaccinations and on replenishing the incomes of workers and families bearing the brunt of the crisis, like the farm workers, the grocery workers, and the restaurant workers in my district. So it is worth the risk. It's worth it because the additional unemployment benefits through the summer will help those who have lost their jobs. The extension of the employee retention tax credit will help keep employees connected to their employer and help small businesses weather the storm. The funding for strike teams will allow staff to go into skilled nursing homes and fight COVID outbreaks. The direct payments to families who are at key thresholds are critical for those who have fallen through the cracks, including children and mixed status families, which is so important to so many people in my district who took the risk to come here, to contribute here, and yeah, live the American dream. The child tax credits will dramatically reduce child poverty and ensure that working parents can afford quality childcare and continue to work. And of course, the expansion of the earned income tax credit allows people to live up to the American creed that work is rewarded. And the EITC allows government to live up to its part of that core bargain, that by helping the American worker can climb out and climb into the middle class. This rescue package is imbued, it's filled with that underlying creed that even in the middle of this pandemic, we can have individual responsibility, shared prosperity, and equal access to opportunity. The American people need to know that we are here to help them live up to that creed and that government works for them now more than ever. As one of my favorite columnists said last week, when your great nation is facing decline because of rising inequality, insecurity, distrust, and alienation, you don't just sit there, you try to do something big. Mr. Chairman, President Biden understands that we must go big. The American people need us to go big. I believe that if we take that risk, if we continue to do our job, we'll not just win the race against this pandemic, we'll win the race for the future of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Murphy, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
The COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic crisis is still deeply affecting our country and my Central Florida community. With people continuing to get sick and many still unable to return to work, the need for additional assistance is urgent. With new COVID variants spreading and pandemic unemployment benefits expiring soon, we really don't have a moment to lose to address the needs of our constituents. We cannot afford to respond to this pandemic at the pace of politics. So I think we have to take the most efficient and pragmatic approaches to eliminating the virus and delivering economic relief for workers and businesses. And I'm proud to be a part of this committee, which has crafted so many good provisions to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic crisis. And those provisions will be included in that broader reconciliation bill. There are three provisions, though, I'm particularly proud of. First, the bill includes an extension of our bipartisan employer retention tax credit. You know, we created the ERTC in CARES. We were able to expand it and extend it through June 30th in the Consolidated Appropriations Act last December. And now, through the reconciliation process, we're going to be able to extend it through the end of the year. And the JCT estimates that this will give businesses the financial incentive to retain or rehire at least 13 million workers. And as this bill moves through the legislative process, I'm going to work with House and Senate leaders to explore additional ways to make sure that the ERTC is supporting worker retention at the most severely impacted businesses. I think it can have a real impact. And I'm going to continue to my efforts to inform and educate the business community about this credit so that they can use it to the benefit of their workers and their companies. The second provision I'd like to highlight is the bill will provide a $1,400 economic impact payment to eligible Americans, and that's going to benefit nearly 15 million Floridians. This bill will enhance the child tax credit, helping over 4.5 million Florida families. And it's going to expand the earned income tax credit, which helps over 1.6 million Florida workers. This is huge for Floridians. And I'm also really grateful that the bill treats Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and other U.S. territories fairly under both the CTC and the EITC. It corrects a long-standing injustice that has been faced by our fellow American citizens in the territories. And this will do so much to improve the quality of life, whether that's in San Juan or in St. Croix. And then finally, the bill is going to help millions of working families afford the cost of childcare by enhancing the Child Independent Care Tax Credit. And I have been championing a bipartisan bill on this subject called the PACE Act since I got to Congress, and I'm just so pleased that core elements of it are included in this package at a time when child independent care is so necessary as people try to return to work. I thank the chairman for his work on this vital bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for the purpose of striking the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A motion to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, let's get real about this. This bailout package is clearly loaded with a lot of favors to the Democrats' special interest groups, to their donors, to their political allies. We talk about crushing the virus. We all want to crush the virus. That's been most of the conversation today. Less than 9% of the money that's allocated in this bailout package goes for vaccinations, to put shots in people's arms, to provide health care equipment, PPE equipment. Less than 9%. But 90% of the lips moving was talking about crushing the virus. They want to distract you from the majority of this bailout package that are special gifts to their voters, their political allies, and their friends. Let's say for what it is. Think about this. More than $1 trillion of money has already been appropriated in prior bipartisan COVID packages. More than $1 trillion has been appropriated. The money is there. There's no need for an additional $1.9 trillion. If you count this 1.9 to what we've already spent, that adds up to more than $17,000 per every American. I would ask the Americans back home, have you got $17,000 of benefit from Congress in the last 11 months? We all know what the answer is. When they talk about these unemployment benefits and how adding $400 more a week, let me tell you how that affects the people of Missouri. Under the terms of this bill, an average monthly pay for an individual on unemployment would be $3,080. An individual making $15 per hour, the minimum wage laid out in this bailout package would be $2,400 a month. No one is talking about, whenever you bring forth the $15 minimum wage, that 31 million Americans who are on fixed Social Security benefits will now have an increase in cost of goods. They're going to have to choose between whether to have heat in their house, whether to pay for their pharmaceutical drugs, or whether to put food on the table because of this increase in minimum wage. They will not tell you about the people who are disabled who are working that will lose their job at the sheltered workshops because of this increase in minimum wage. Folks, they are not the party of the working class. They are the party of Wall Street and the elites, and they are governing in this bailout package accordingly. Let me tell you, back home in my state, the minimum wage is $10.30 an hour. An individual receiving the additional $400 from this bill under unemployment benefits it would be double of what a minimum wage worker in Missouri would have. So when the Republican leader of this committee in his opening statement said that more than half of the people working would make more money on unemployment benefits than at their job, that's a fact in the state of Missouri. And I don't know if it's your choice to try to reward people who aren't, working every day. I don't understand it, but I clearly believe in this phrase back home that says, "You're all hat and no cattle." That's exactly what this legislation is. It's all hat and no cattle. If we're trying to help the working class, Mr. Chairman, I'm all in. I'm probably the only Republican of this committee that voted for the $2,000 checks to the working class. I would love to work with you all to make sure that we're delivering aid to the most vulnerable, the working class, but I am not going to support a bailout bill that's going to reward the Democrats' political donors, continue to fire American workers with the stroke of a pen. This is unacceptable. This is hard on this nation. Let's put shots in people's arms, crush the virus, and take care of the working class. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Gomez, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I find it just appalling, to be honest with you, when I hear my colleagues on the other
Could
side
the gentleman
of the
speak
aisle
into the microphone, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I said I find it appalling when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle always talk about how we're catering to special interests when it comes to, but these are folks that I consider my constituents, my friends, right? Firefighters, teachers, nurses, people who are struggling to make ends meet every single day. And they call it like that they don't deserve the help, that they're going to get more than they deserve. But when they passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut of corporate welfare, they had no problem doing that. A tax cut that benefited the top 0.1% of this country. No problems. We're going to step a line. We're going to vote for that. But when it comes to actually giving aid and support to the people that I've been visiting in the food lines and the vaccination sites week after week for over a year, yeah, that is something that I find appalling when they compare the two. So we know that this pandemic started in 2020, but its effects and and what's going on has spilled into 2021. So we need to take big strides to help the people who are being disproportionately impacted. That's especially true when it comes to communities of color, immigrant communities, essential workers on the front lines of this health emergency who just bear the brunt of this pandemic. In my district, COVID-related deaths among Latinos have soared by almost 1,000% since November. But I don't hear my friends on the other side of the aisle talking about that. The unemployment rate remains well above 10%, and the rate is even higher amongst people of color. And the Black and Latino communities are considerably at risk due to systemic barriers and inequities in vaccine distribution. And that it has resulted in low rates of vaccinations throughout the country. So I do believe this bill will help remedy some of these inequities and help working families. I know it doesn't cut taxes for corporate America, which Republicans are always willing to go and vote for. But this is something that is absolutely necessary. We need to increase the federal, we're going to increase the federal supplement to unemployment benefits to $400 a week and provide more weeks of life-saving benefits. That's a big deal, especially for gig workers and workers who are now eligible for this benefit. It's going to be a big, big deal for the people of my district. Mixed status immigrant families, a group I will continue to work to fight for in every COVID relief package, will get the financial support they desperately need as well. Immigrant families newly included in the December stimulus bill will continue to be eligible for stimulus payments. 2.2 million U.S. citizen or legal immigrant children left out of past rounds of stimulus payments will now be eligible for relief. That is a big deal. The expansion of relief to mixed status families is a major win. However, the fight to protect immigrant families is not over. And I will continue to fight to secure financial assistance for millions of tax contributing immigrants that risk their lives in the essential workforce but are barred from receiving federal financial assistance. These are not folks who asked for a handout. These are folks who came here and are working and paying taxes, but yet my colleagues never, on the other side of the aisle, never talk about that. They call them, welfare recipients, even though they're not accepting any welfare. So I want to just say that we need to continue pushing on this package. People are suffering. And if you don't see it, come to my district and I can walk you around in the streets. And you can let people ask you, what are you going to do to help their situation? And giving the corporate tax cuts to the largest corporations in this country is not the answer they're looking for. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me now remind the committee that we will ask, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? And if hearing none, we will proceed to the report section and prepare to accept opening amendment requests.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Brady has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Byer?
I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from Virginia has reserved a point of order. And now we will await electronically the amendment being passed out. Committee will suspend while the clerk distributes the amendment. Members present on the WebEx platform should be receiving amendments in your inbox now, and physical copies are being distributed to members in the hearing room. We'll give the clerk a moment to make sure this is accomplished. Are there any members who have not yet received the amendment? I believe I've seen 2 or 3 hands go up. 4, 5, 6 hands go up. I'm glad the hands are going up in a bipartisan fashion. As the amendment has been circulated, are there any hands up for not having yet received the amendment? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, the ranking member, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proposing an amendment that creates a better way to help our unemployed, tailored to them and to the state benefits. First, I would like to quickly fact-check Mr. Doggett's false claim that Republicans oppose federal unemployment benefits. Clearly, a strong support for the CARES Act of the $600, strong support for the December package as well. Simply a smarter approach that helps the jobless get back to work is what Republicans support. The multiple false claims that tax cuts went 80% went to the wealthy. Factcheck.org says this claim is simply misleading. Of course, Mr. Pascrell's false claim, Republicans have no health care plan. The American Health Care Act passed May 4th, 2017 out of the House. The only other point I'd make is let's be careful in our discussions about accusing or inferring others cause deaths of either
colleagues or others, that's nonsense. Let's not go there. So thank goodness that we had one of the strongest economies in the country pre-COVID. Thankfully, we had the highest household income on record thanks to President Trump and the Republican tax cuts. We had the lowest poverty rate on record and the lowest unemployment rates for blacks, Hispanic, women, and low income. But for us to rebuild our economy, we need to make sure temporary job losses don't turn into permanent ones. We have to remove barriers to help people get back to work. Just like the $600 added federal weekly benefit last year, this $400 one-size-fits-all bonus is poorly targeted and ends up with many jobless receiving more in benefits than they earned on the job. This does discourage work because people are smart. It does hurt small businesses in hiring. Listen to them, they'll tell you this. And it helps delay this recovery. An American Action Forum article published Monday estimates at the $400 level nationally, 50% of workers could make more on unemployment than at work. I'd like to submit this article and the chart for the record.
Without objection.
So the chart shows the percentage of workers that would make more with the $400 a week unemployment supplement and how much more they would make, so my colleagues can see exactly what that means in your state. For example, in Texas, 55% of workers would make more than at work and could make up to 177% more than when they are working. That's nearly double. In Alabama, 45% of workers would make more, could make up to 175% more than at work. This isn't hypothetical. There is a better way to help our unemployed and help them return to the workforce. Instead of the flat, one-size-fits-all $400, my amendment sets the federal unemployment bonus as equal to 50% of an unemployed worker's weekly benefit amount. That's determined, as you know, by the state. Benefit approach, it individualizes unemployment, tailors it to the worker, it's anchored in their prior wages. It is state policy, and it recognizes the regional differences in wages. It also means no one would end up making more on unemployment than when they were working. We ran the numbers, and using this formula, wage replacement rates would range from 71% in Indiana up to 98% in Oregon. That means this would be fair, it would be crucial, but no one would make more unemployed than they would at work. Importantly, this approach doesn't require states to change their benefit calculation formulas. The benefit amounts already known in each state. The state would only need to apply a multiplier, issue a second check in that amount. This amendment offers a fair and tailored alternative, provides really a more productive path for targeting additional unemployment assistance to those who need it, and they need it, without the hazard of creating a permanent class of long-term unemployed or creating barriers to reconnecting the jobless back to their work, which we all support. Mr. Chairman, there are 6.6 million job openings as of today. We have to do our best to help people get back to work. I urge my colleagues to support this fair and reasonable amendment to the underlying bill. Yield back, Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Does the gentleman from Virginia continue to insist upon his point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois to speak on the amendment. Mr. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Davis, would you unmute, please?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this amendment. Unemployment law is clear. Workers do not have the option of choosing to stay on unemployment insurance. If they were called to work by their employer or offered suitable work, a job that is safe to take an appropriate action to their skills, they can either accept the job or not, but either way, they forego their unemployment benefits. Surveys overwhelmingly show that when people don't return to work, it's not because of their unemployment insurance benefits, because they think it's not safe, and in many cases during the pandemic, they're right. This amendment would delay benefits to workers in need by weeks or more likely months. State administrators have repeatedly warned us that their antiquated computer systems cannot be quickly reprogrammed to do all of these individual calculations. And we saw that when some workers waited for months for pandemic assistance and finally were paid a base minimum benefit with the promise of corrections later. The amendment is in the nature of a strict substitute, is the only structure that will allow states to get funds to workers now so they can pay their bills and put food on the table. You can't retroactively eat. You can't afford medicine retroactively. Businesses can't retroactively benefit from the weeks of lost spending. I cannot support an amendment that would halt benefits for needy workers who were unemployed through no fault of their own. The National Association of State Workforce Agencies previously said that the simplest version of an emergency supplement would take states between 8 to 20 weeks. Trying to figure out ways to reduce the amount of money that low-income workers especially, individuals who don't earn very much to begin with, certainly should not be the intent of any legislation that we have. This bill is not in the best interest of workers. It is not in the best, this amendment is not in the best interest of those seeking to benefit. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would urge that we vote against this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, to speak on the amendment. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As has been said, we Republicans have demonstrated in good faith over the past several months on 6 occasions with $4 trillion that we're willing to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and our friends across the aisle to get this right. We are all heartbroken for those who continue to suffer as a result of the pandemic, government mandates, things outside of their control. And I think I can speak on behalf of my colleagues on the Republican side that where there are needs, where there are gaps, and where we can grab the hand of our fellow countrymen and lift them up and out of this bad situation, we are more than at the ready to do that. But compassion is one thing, and it is a good thing. But we are also have to use our heads and be responsible lawmakers. And I don't think, Mr. Chairman, there's any excuse for not putting a provision in this enhanced unemployment insurance that prevents people who we want to help and we want to lift up and sustain with a safety net, especially during this time, to ensure that they're not making more money than they did in their previous job. There is not an American, if we were having a hearing and we could look out into the sea of people in the Ways and Means Committee room, that wouldn't nod their head saying, of course, that should be fundamental to whatever we do to help. Let's not throw money where there's not a need, and let's not, for heaven's sakes, in the name of compassion, disincentivize the very thing that is best for our country and for our fellow citizens, and that's being able to get back to work and provide a living for their families. That's what they want. And this, I commend the ranking member Brady for this very simple and much needed provision and guardrail against it. Some people, Mr. Chairman, could make upwards of 177% of what they made prior to COVID and their unemployment. Everywhere I go in West Texas, from the family farmers, the independent oil and gas employers, or just mom and pop shops of all kinds, they say, please, when you're helping us, be responsible and don't hurt us with your good intentions and your compassion by freezing out these people that they need to rehire and get them back on the payroll. Because ultimately, that's the best thing we could do is get folks on the payroll and get them down the road. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this, and I cannot imagine a single one of my colleagues, and I wish I could see them all. I cannot imagine that they wouldn't support this basic guardrail and responsible provision as we help our friends. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington. Let me recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, to speak on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a simple amendment to write, but it's very difficult to implement. I guess Mr. Brady was not listening to Mr. Schweiger talking about the casework staff. The unemployment agencies are overburdened. And in response, Mr. Brady and the Republicans are offering something that is going to make it more complicated. The state's antiquated computer systems cannot be quickly reprogrammed to these individual calculations. Bear witness to the problems you're having with the system right now. And this, in part, is due to our Republican friends over the years having budget cuts when they were in charge after the Great Recession to try and help states upgrade these systems. But the point is, they haven't, they can't, and this would delay needed benefits for 2, 3, 4, 5 months. It's not simple. It doesn't make sense. But the underlying premise is flawed. People cannot, as my friend Mr. Davis pointed out, people don't have a choice about whether or not they're going to return to work or not. The law is clear. If they're recalled to work by their employer or are offered suitable work, they either accept the job or they forego their benefits. We don't need this unnecessary complication. The bottom line is that surveys show overwhelmingly that when people don't return to work, it's not because of unemployment benefits. It's because they think it is not safe. And in many cases during this pandemic, because of the botched response from the Trump administration and dealing with a whole host of workplace safety issues, the workers are right. So this amendment is not simple. This amendment is not necessary. And this amendment would delay needed benefits for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of our employees. I strongly urge that it be rejected.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Ferguson, to speak on the amendment. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member for bringing this very common sense amendment to the committee. Listen, I think a couple of things that we need to recognize is, number one, is this is not a complicated formula. This is something that many states and most states already use with their state benefits. And we should be able, as a nation, to figure out how to ensure that people don't make more receiving unemployment than they do from their paychecks. And I believe that using the current state formulas, that we can't do this. And I don't think that it would take 8 to 20 weeks to implement. I think this is something that we could get out the door very, very easily. And look, we can get this done before the current benefits run out in March. But it's a very, many of my Democrat colleagues said last year that they agreed that you should not make more on unemployment than you make from your regular paycheck. And I think that that's a reasonable position to take. Can you really go out into America and say, we think it's right to pay somebody more than what they were earning prior to COVID or prior to losing their job? No, it is not. And you cannot go out into and face Americans and say that it is acceptable to pay people more when they're unemployed than when they were employed. That does not make any sense. It's wrong. And let's be clear. Why should we do that? This is not, listen, all of us recognize that there are real challenges with people getting back to work. That is why we stand ready to work with you in a bipartisan manner to make sure that businesses can continue to open and states can continue to reopen in a safe and effective manner so that we can begin to rebuild our economy with job creation. But it is not acceptable to spend more money than we have to, add to the deficit. This is an enormous amount of money, and then and then pass that debt on to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We've long passed since spending it on our children. Very simply, can you look at your constituents that have jobs and say, we are going to put the tax burden on you and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, because we aren't willing to take a stand to say, well, it's not right to pay somebody more for unemployment than they were making when they had a job. I urge adoption of this amendment. It's common sense. It's the right approach. It's not going to take 8 to 20 weeks. States already use this formula. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, on the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You know, as I look at this amendment, I guess I want to say to my colleagues who are wondering who would not be for this amendment, I reject the basic thrust of this amendment. The citation of the $400 a week sort of tracks about as closely as you can get to a starvation, a minimum wage job for a single person. And the whole thrust of this amendment is to not, quote unquote, spoil people by giving them too much money and to increase their expectation in an economy that we want to grow to earn more than $7.25 an hour. And so I would hope that that the committee would reject this amendment. Not only would it be hard to implement and be timely, not only does it fly in the face of the whole notion of unemployment, that you really are unemployed, but it really decreases the expectation that a hardworking person who's working as hard as they possibly can, does not deserve to live above a starvation level wage. So with that, I would yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank the Republican leader for his input. Let me just share with you my experience hiring thousands of people over the years. You want to make sure in terms of pay plans or unemployment, you set up the proper incentives. And I can just tell you, it's not just looking at the federal piece, but it's a state piece. We have in Florida, and everybody's economy is different. New York and California might be different than Florida, but in Southwest Florida, we need workers. And we don't want to set up any improper incentives, disincentives that would impact that. I can just tell you, we're talking to a lot of people in our region. They're looking for more workers. And there's always people that do need some support on this. But the bottom line is what the Republican leader is recommending makes sense. The other thing I would just like to share with the chairman, we've always been the one, I think, committee that best works together. And we represent, as has been brought up to me many times over the years on the committee, we represent close to half the people in the country. We've got a lot of good ideas and thoughts that we can bring from the business world and other places, as well as focusing on our constituents as you can. It's really disappointing that we can't work together especially on an area like this, because you can't just look at the federal piece. You got to look at the state piece and how that impacts everything. If the state of Florida is offering 300 and we're giving them 400, that's 700. 50 weeks, that's 35,000. You're going to take a lot of people out of the workplace, especially in terms of restaurants and everywhere else, where they're not going to have the incentive, not going to want to maybe go back to work. Not to say everybody's that way, but there are a lot of people, they're going to look at it in terms of human nature. And what I found over the years, they're going to look at what's in some type, their own interest. And I don't want this to be a disincentive for people to get back to work if they get laid off. So again, I think I would only say that I think the Republican leader is moving in the right direction. I support what he's got, but it needs to be a larger discussion, a dialogue where we can come together and do something that makes sense and get as many people back to work as quickly as we can, because these small businesses, I can tell you in our region, especially in terms of restaurant, retail, and other things, you need these workers, and many of them don't make $700 a week. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, who I believe is the last individual who has requested time on the amendment. Mr. Byer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I'd just like to make 3 points about the ranking member's amendment. First is that it punishes workers in those states that are miserly in their unemployment insurance. If you have a state that decides it's giving very little to their people, with this 50%, this means they're going to continue to get very little. And the workers in the more responsible states are going to do a lot better. So basically, it doesn't punish the leaders or the management or the budgeteers of the miserly states. It just punishes their people. The second point to make is that when we looked at the $600 unemployment benefit bump in the CARES Act, there was no research that showed that people were staying out of the job market because of that $600. In fact, the research all showed the exact opposite. The plural of anecdote is not data. And for anyone who might make more, let's remember that these are the lowest earners. These are the people who have most been denied the American dream. People making $7.25 an hour, yes, they might make more with this $400, but these are the people who've been losing on everything else in their lives. Whether the Tax Cut and Jobs Act gave 80% to the most wealthy or 20% to the most wealthy, no one can argue that the wealthiest among us don't get far more than their fair share of American resources. And the last thing I say is that this amendment just institutionalizes keeping people at the lowest earning level at that lowest earning level. It locks them in and makes sure that the poor stay poor in America. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The question is now on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady. And please, members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
May I ask the ayes and ayes?
The gentleman from Texas has asked for the yeas and the nays. A record vote has been requested, and since this is the first record vote we are taking in a hybrid format, let me go quickly through the process. All members who are present in the hearing room should remain here to vote. Those who are present on the WebEx platform should remain logged in and vote via the WebEx platform. We are going to allow the clerk to set up, and then everyone will have the ability to be recorded. Members present on WebEx must have their cameras turned on. Tech support is available with any connection issues. The clerk will call the roll, and each member will be responsible for unmuting. We will try to give you a moment, if needed, to unmute yourself before moving to the next name. When you are recognized, please say your last name before stating your vote. So, for example, Mr. Thompson would respond when called upon with Thompson votes aye, Thompson votes no. This will help the clerk visually confirm your identity when you vote. The clerk will go through the roll call once, and then we'll come back to any names that were not recorded on the first round. It looks as though we are prepared to proceed with the vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Mr. Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell.
Pasquale votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis.
Mr. Davis, would you unmute yourself, please?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee.
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Mr. Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi votes no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez votes no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunes votes yes.
Mr. Nunez votes yes. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
Aye, yes.
Mr. Reed votes yes. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes yes.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes yes. Mr. Rice.
Yes.
Mr. Rice.
Ice votes yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Mr. Walorski.
Walorski votes yes.
Mr. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood votes yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Winstrup.
Wenstrup votes yes.
Dr. Winstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson votes yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Yes.
Mr. Hearn votes yes. Ms. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
No. Neal votes no.
Mr. Neal votes no.
Give the clerk a moment to report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
There being 24, what was it? Would you, clerk, repeat that, please?
Yes, sir, I have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
There being 24 noes and 18 ayes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Byer?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from Virginia has reserved a point of order, and we'll give the staff a moment to present the amendment for those in the room and electronically. Thank you. Have all members received the amendment?
Give us a minute.
We'll give you another minute. How are we doing? We're good? I believe we are prepared to proceed, and the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. I want to take this opportunity to introduce an amendment that I think will help us get the resources to where they need to go the most, to help those who need it the most. I'm very concerned that the bill in its current form is basically tone deaf as it relates to Main Street businesses all across America. We know that folks are out of work. We also know that there are segments of our economy who need more workers. This amendment is designed to help the bill achieve the goals of getting our economy back on track and ultimately helping to crush the virus. The employment situation across the country varies widely, as we know, from state to state, and our unemployment system should recognize this variation. While I share concern about states where unemployment has spiked, many states continue to have very low unemployment rates. Nebraska, in fact, has an unemployment rate of just 3%. We are one of 18 states with an unemployment rate below 5%. The biggest concern I hear from Nebraska small businesses is their inability to fill jobs while offering good wages, safe jobs as well. The same situation perhaps so many were experiencing prior to the pandemic. They saw this situation made worse by the $600 add-on last spring, and I'm certain that the $400 add-on that's currently being proposed will actually undermine efforts in states like Nebraska. This amendment would allow states to choose how to deploy the additional employment funds provided by the bill based on each state's unique situation. This amendment does not impact the overall unemployment insurance funding in the bill. It would still provide every state enough funds to actually pay the $400 per week in additional unemployment funding through August 29. However, this amendment would actually empower states to decide how to best deploy those funds to address the needs of the unemployed. Let me repeat, to address the needs of the unemployed. States could still choose to offer, as I mentioned, the full $400 supplemental UI, and I assume many of the governors would probably do just that. However, states could instead choose to pay a different supplemental amount, like $100, $200, or $300, uniformly to all UI claimants while using the rest of the funds to provide reemployment services or pay back-to-work bonuses when claimants return to the workforce. I'll summarize it again. This amendment does not cut the funding in the bill. It allows every state to pay the $400 supplemental benefit the majority has proposed. It provides additional flexibility, however, for states to help people to safely return to the workforce, which I would hope is the goal of everyone on this dais and attending this meeting today. This is a great opportunity to demonstrate a win-win bipartisan effort, and I urge support, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Hearing none, we will proceed to a vote on the gentleman's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, if I can simply offer that I oppose the amendment.
Mr. Byer, do you want to be recognized?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized on the amendment.
Only to reiterate most of the arguments we made with the ranking member's previous amendment, that the need for return-to-work bonuses is not putting the money where it is most needed, and that overall moving to a lower weekly supplement level is going to punish the people who need the money the most. And with that, I oppose the amendment.
Thank the gentleman. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for a voice vote. Those in favor of the gentleman's amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Say no.
No. No.
There's a chorus.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ready?
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, has requested a recorded vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will now call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell.
Pascrell votes no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins votes no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee.
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Mr. Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez votes no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunes votes yes.
Mr. Nunez votes yes. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Smith of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes yes.
Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood is a yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Winstrup.
Winstrup votes yes.
Dr. Winstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is a yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes is a yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn votes yes.
Mr. Hearn votes yes. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Reed. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Neal votes no.
Mr. Neal votes no.
The clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, the results are 24 noes and 17 yeas.
There being 24 nays and 17 ayes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hearn, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Hearn is recognized to speak on his amendment. If he would just postpone for a moment while we pass out the amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman has reserved a point of order on this amendment. Has everybody received the amendment? I think we're waiting for one person. I believe that one person has now received the amendment. Okay. Does the gentleman continue to insist on his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order.
The gentleman has withdrawn his point of order, and the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, being a new member on the committee, I know it's shocking, but I'm going to offer an amendment that has had bipartisan support up until this point. The Biden plan before us today would extend the CARES Act unemployment benefits through the end of August. My amendment would simply put in place a phase-out period so we can make sure these programs remain temporary and are phased out responsibly. Unfortunately, this bill removes the phase-out provision from the bipartisan package that we passed just some 45 days ago that this committee agreed to put in place. The amount of the unemployment aid in this bill is grossly disproportionate compared to the past recessions. We have allocated an estimated $630 billion to unemployment benefits since the beginning of the pandemic last year. To put that in perspective, combined federal and state unemployment spending in 2020 was 3 times that of the next highest year, which was 2010. We have a chart to show this historical comparative spending. I will submit it for the record. In the past, Congress has ended emergency benefits much sooner as unemployment rates fell. During the last recession, an additional $25 payment per week was made. It ended when unemployment was at 9.3%. When unemployment was 6.7%, Congress ended all extra federal weeks of benefits. Now unemployment is at 6.3%, and the nonpartisan CBO projects unemployment will be at 5.3% by the fourth quarter of 2021. Yet, the majority strategy is to continue increased unemployment benefits with no end in sight. Last March, Democrats argued bonuses were needed to help workers while, quote, the consumer economy is shuttering. But here we are talking about providing an additional $400 per week for another 6 months. It makes no sense for us to be discussing long-term plans to discourage workers when the nonpartisan CBO quoted this month that real GDP is expected to return to pre-pandemic levels by this summer. The ink is barely dry on the bipartisan December bill. Let's give those funds a chance to work before starting over. As state economies have reopened, the added unemployment funds should expire. At the very least, we should make sure that the plan is to end these programs responsibly. Our top priority should be putting Americans back to work, but we will never fill reopening jobs if our workforce is handsomely incentivized to stay home. This amendment adds an application deadline and a gradual phase-out period so unemployed workers don't face another cliff in September. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment as you have done with the bipartisan support over the past year to this underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment, and now I would like to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, to speak on the amendment. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This Republican amendment would add yet greater uncertainty for workers who are still working or who will return to work by cutting off their access to this federal unemployment benefit if and when they lose their jobs, perhaps this summer. We all hope that this pandemic will end and that people will be able to return to work. In fact, we're doing more than helping. In the bills that we're considering this week, we are taking decisive action to give President Biden the tools to get more people vaccinated and end this pandemic. But we know how long, we don't know precisely how long this will take or how quickly the economy will recover once it's safe for everyone to return to work. If there's a phase-out period for which benefits are being paid out for existing claimants, but newly unemployed workers can no longer apply, as would be the case in this provision, we'll be putting newly unemployed workers pitted against those who have been out of work for a very long time. Instead, we should extend the benefits for as long as needed. We have to have policy that matches the problem. But here, as I've said, with or without this amendment, if workers are able to return to their jobs safely before August 29, they will. We've seen that already during this pandemic. And under federal and state law, workers who are recalled to work by their employers and offered suitable employment can't receive unemployment benefits anyway. This is just another effort, I think, to cut this benefit, but also, importantly, this is an insult to the American worker. The people I represent, any day of the week, would take a job and the dignity that comes with work over an unemployment benefit. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to be heard on the gentleman from Oklahoma's amendment? The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that the argument was just made that these benefits should be offered in perpetuity. I realize there's a deadline that it's established in the bill, a sunset, so to speak. But I can predict, I think, with great accuracy that we will be back here saying, well, we can't have a cliff. We can't have a cliff and leave people out there like this with the benefits just stopping. And we know that we've had a multitude of other proposals in legislation here that has been considered temporary. It's not. This amendment is a thoughtful approach to addressing some of the realities that happen on this campus. And one of those realities is it's said to be temporary, and it's really not. Arguments are made to extend. But this amendment, I think, offers a good bit of forethought and acknowledges the realities that exist here. And really setting up a process, though, to do the right thing and not just let things last forever. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I simply offer two small insights. The sponsor of the amendment points out that the official unemployment rate's fallen to 6-point-something%, but even the Bureau of Labor Statistics and many economists point out that it's understated by at least 3%. So our actual unemployment rate is 9% plus. And then when you break it down by groups, our African-American unemployment rate officially is at 9.8%, which again, based on the understatement, is probably more like 12 or 13%. And this, and one more small fact, a third of those unemployed in America right today are long-term unemployed. They've been unemployed for more than 27 weeks. These clearly recognize that putting a cliff in is going to hurt these people the most. With
Thank
that,
the
Mr. Chairman,
gentleman.
I yield back.
Is there any other member that would like to be heard on this amendment? The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, is recognized on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To speak in regards to the amendment, we've heard a lot of conversation from our colleagues, and I just want to point out in an executive order that one of the tens of executive orders that President Biden has done, in one of them, he directed the Department of Labor a guaranteed right to refuse employment for the fear of getting COVID. This was an executive order that you can qualify for unemployment benefits. You're guaranteed by your own choice, just with the fear. So I wanted to clarify that because that's exactly what their president signed an executive order. And so to make it completely clear, I also want to point out that we all want people to work safely. We want people to show up. We want our country to come back to normal. And we would love for Congress to show up for work and to be in session and to have debates. Because the people who pick up our trash have never missed a week. The people who stock the shelves at our grocery stores have never missed a week. Members of Congress should be held to the same standard, and we should show up and do our job and be here and not fall underneath the premise that one doctor says we can't do this. When most members of Congress have had their vaccinations, or most members of Congress has probably already had COVID, we can show up, do our job, much like the American people. We should not be held to a different standard than the rest of Americans. I support this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman should know that I haven't missed a day. In fact, particularly in my constituent offices back in Springfield and Pittsfield, every single day we participated, beginning with the first acknowledgement of the first infection. And we have been at it ever since. So with that, let me recognize the gentleman from Georgia to speak on the amendment, Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, the gentleman from Michigan said something that rang true with me, and that given the opportunity to go back to work, our fellow Americans want to go back to work. And I fully agree with that. But also know that in many parts of this country, when people are paid more to be on unemployment than their jobs, they will take that larger check. In many cases, it's sometimes 20, 30, or 40% more than they make at work. I see that. It's a difference. Maybe it's something that we see in rural parts of America that's different than more urban settings. But that is a reality, and it's a reality that I have employers every single day coming to me telling me that they cannot get workers to come in because they make more on unemployment than they do at their job. But being able to phase out these unemployment benefits, as this amendment suggests, is a common sense approach. We either believe that we're headed in the right direction with the steps that are being taken regarding vaccines, regarding the social distancing and mask wearing to defeat this virus, and if we are going to push forward with $1.9 trillion worth of spending in an effort to restart the economy, then shouldn't we recognize that if the economy is going to restart, that we should begin to phase benefits out? It's a common sense approach. So I encourage my members of this committee to vote in support of this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina to speak on the amendment. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with my colleagues that having this hearing virtually makes no sense. We should be in Washington sitting in the committee room together. If the Senate can sit in the Senate chamber together to hold the hearing they're holding today, there's no reason on God's earth that House members can't do the same thing. And if we fully expect our grocery workers and our trash haulers and our medical personnel to be going to work every day, I don't know how we can face our constituents if we insist on doing everything virtually. I think one of the biggest frustrations of our constituents is that we aren't, you know, they expect us to be there 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, and we're sitting here on a computer trying to accomplish what we should be doing much more effectively in the committee room. And on to this unemployment benefit. You know, one of the hardest people that I've had to answer through the process of COVID is a restaurant worker at my favorite restaurant in Myrtle Beach, Magnolia's. And when I go in, the gentleman always comes to me, and he's an older gentleman who's been working there, for decades. And he says, "How can you do this to me?" He said, I know a lot of people who have sit at home and collect this enhanced unemployment benefit. And one of the mischaracterizations that people have repeated here is that this is just $400 a week. It's not. It's $400 a week in addition to your normal unemployment benefit. He said, "How can you do this? Because I've been working since this started. I've not missed a day. I've been working throughout, and these people that I know can go home and make more than I can when I'm out here doing what I'm supposed to do and earning my paycheck and keeping this economy running." And that's a difficult question to answer. So it's absolutely irresponsible that we can't adopt this amendment that would tune this out over time when we're able to do it. Since March 15, 2020, an estimated $5.13 billion in unemployment benefits have been paid out in South Carolina. That's over $1,000 for every man, woman, and child that lives in the state of South Carolina that somebody's going to have to pay back. Over $1,000 for every single man, woman, and child in the state of South Carolina, including $1.1 billion from the state's unemployment insurance fund, which will certainly have to be paid back by South Carolina taxpayers. So if we can't adopt this simple amendment that will assure that this benefit that encourages workers not to work. In fact, I've got some statistical proof of that. In December, right after we adopted the second package, the relief package that extended these unemployment benefits, unemployment ticked up significantly in the state of South Carolina. Why? Because it became profitable for people to leave work and to go on employment rather than stay at work. And I know that you say, well, people would rather go to work. They would. Most of them would. But people also are not dumb that they recognize that if they can make more staying at home, why wouldn't they stay home? So no, we've got to encourage folks to get back to work and do it as quickly as possible. You know, the tax relief plan that everybody's decried, the Democrats have decried on this call, was so successful. We had sub 4% unemployment in this country only a year ago, only 1 year ago. And all I want to do is do whatever we can to get back to those days of prosperity when my biggest problem was employers calling me saying, how am I supposed to get workers? I can't find enough workers. I want to get back there, and wages were growing. I want to get back to that spot as quickly as we can. And all we have to do is work our way through this pandemic and then get government out of the way. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member, Mr. Brady, to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am not sure I understand the manufactured outrage about this amendment. It is an insult to the American worker? Seriously? All this amendment does is offer a bipartisan approach to phase out the benefits so that workers don't face an immediate cliff. That can be really tough on families. Republicans and Democrats have long supported the concept of phase out because it makes sense and allows people to have a glide path back. So much so that every Democrat on this committee, and those of us who voted for the past December COVID relief bill, put this into the bill. 2 months ago, we all agreed this was a good idea. And over years, we've always agreed this is a good idea. So what I worry about is this seems to be sending a signal to the whole country. The Democrats have been instructed, do not work with Republicans, do not accept in any way the ideas they are offering to make this a better bill. Make sure you go it your way in a bitter partisan bill. I just don't think, we're not through this pandemic yet, medically or economically. I think we need to look for ways to work together, and this amendment, I think, is just an obvious example, a common sense example of reiterating what we've already supported. I know, Mr. Smith, you've asked briefly to be yielded to, be glad to.
Thank you, Mr. Brady. I do want to add, some months ago, we had a subcommittee hearing in the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee, hearing from restaurateurs. And since then, and even before, we knew that the hospitality industry was getting kicked hard. Let's face it. This overall bill, not to mention, what we're trying to address here in the amendment, but the overall bill, think what that does to Main Street America, to the hospitality industry that we keep hearing over and over and over again how bad things are. So they're going to get hit all across America, not just certain places, all across America with a wage mandate. And then when I hear from many of these folks, they tell me how hard it is to compete against these government programs, such as the now $400 proposal that was $600. And let's keep in mind that this is above and beyond what state benefits were supposedly sufficient before the pandemic. Now, it's so important to keep all of this in mind because it's piling on, one policy after another, making it more and more difficult. Now, I've heard from our colleagues here today who disagree with these Main Street folks. I think it's more believable to hear from Main Street than from some speculation among policymakers that there's a disagreement politically. Let's face it. We need to help Main Street America, not hurt Main Street America. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I am speaking in opposition to the amendment, but I really want to get to the crux of the issue that I'm hearing throughout all of these amendments from my colleagues on the other side. First and foremost, to my colleague who just spoke, the Main Street that I represent in Las Vegas, the hospitality, entertainment industry, which we are known for, is closed in large part because of a pandemic, a public health pandemic. The fact that we don't have the trade shows, the conventions, that impacts people's ability to come to work because they cannot work when individuals cannot travel. And so when you talk about Main Street, let's really talk about the people that are affected by this. I want to ask my colleagues on the other side, can you live on $400 a week plus the state supplemental? Can you cover the housing, the food, the medical for your family? Are you willing to phase out the tax breaks for the ultra wealthy like you want to do to phase out the unemployment insurance benefit for needy families and workers? Because that's essentially what you're trying to pit us against. I worked with you guys in the last package on support for small businesses, paycheck protection. We have a provision that will be voted on the employee retention tax credit, something that we worked together on. So do not sit here and tell me that we're not working together or that we somehow have been told to not work with Republicans. My job is to fight for my constituents who are struggling to survive right now. And this $400 a week supplemental is desperately needed. On top of that, you cannot pit newly unemployed workers against those who have been out of work for a longer period of time, as is in this provision, in this amendment. We believe that we should extend the benefits for as long as we can within the funding that we have in these reconciliation instructions and monitor carefully so that our committee and the Congress can take action again when and if necessary. But the underlying issue that I really want to tackle is the fact that, as my colleague Mr. Beyer said, before COVID, our full unemployment, we had full unemployment at about 3%, 3.5%. You guys wouldn't increase wages then. Now in the middle of COVID, you won't raise wages, but you won't let people live above the poverty line. Can you live off of $400 a week, honestly? Well, if you can't, then your constituents shouldn't either. And that's ultimately what we're dealing with here. People cannot return to work safely. They want to work. I find it insulting when you say people don't want to return to work because they want unemployment. No, they don't. I listen to my constituents all the time. They want to go back to work, but they can't until we crush this virus. And so I would just urge us not to turn this into more than it is. We are here to pass another relief package because our constituents need it in the middle of a pandemic. That's our job. That's what we were elected for. If you don't want to do it, fine. Then let those of us in the majority get this done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize Dr. Winstrup to speak on the amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm glad to live in a country that wants to help people when they're down. It's something that we've always done as Americans. And do things like provide housing, nutrition, and in this case, unemployment benefits where we can. The key is that we do it smartly, and we do it in a way that it will benefit the people now and beyond the problems that they currently are facing. I just wanted to add that, but at that time I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Hearn is recognized.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for yielding. I just want to point of clarity. We've had a lot of back and forth here. This is in addition to the state's unemployment, the traditional unemployment insurance that's currently been given out. And I also want to point out, as I started my I'm the new guy here, and I just piggybacked off a bipartisan approach that happened just in December, and I'm not sure why the thoughts have changed when, again, the nonpartisan CBO has said we're going to be back to pre-pandemic growth this summer, and that we should start looking forward. I mean, the president's agenda is to vaccinate hundreds of millions of people in the first 100 days so that we can get beyond this by early summer and start growing our economy again, because as the president acknowledged, it's jobs. And so this is what his agenda is about, to put people back to work. And so I think it would be certainly irresponsible of us to not be good policymakers and then discourage President Biden's approach to putting people back to work. And I would hope that we'd all look at that. And, to my colleagues who were talking about the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I actually having read the report just this morning that was dated 8:30 a.m. on February 5th, so just 5 days ago, when he talked about how the unemployment rate had fallen in January 0.4 percentage points to 6.3, there's no mention of an additional 3% error. As a matter of fact, he goes back and he looks at last year and does a seasonally adjusted of March of last year, and it was only off by 0.1%. So the models they have are pretty accurate. And to all my colleagues and to some of the folks I've worked with for 30 years, the biggest hit has been in the restaurant and hospitality industry. So again, recognizing that's where the big hit is, we could be more targeted in our funding as well. So just trying to be responsible. I know, like all of you are, want to make sure we get the money in the right people's hands at the right time so that we can encourage this economy to open up quicker than we would otherwise do in some of the policy making that we do here. So with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this amendment? Seeing and hearing none, the question is on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Is there?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the yeas and nays.
Mr. Smith is requesting the yeas and nays. With that, is the gentleman for Virginia, we're good?
Yeah.
Okay. So the clerk will call the roll. I will remind people, members that are on the call, unmute yourself. A record vote has been requested, and members are reminded that your camera must stay on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Mr. Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine.
Kine, no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell.
Pascrell, no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
No. Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee.
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Pulling teeth out of a chicken.
Mr. Evans votes no.
You got another vote.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Hang out.
Mr. Schneider votes no.
Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
Votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Mr. Smith, Missouri, aye.
Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes.
Walorski votes yes.
Mr. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood votes yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Winstrup.
Winstrup votes yes.
Dr. Winstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington, yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson votes yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn votes yes.
Mr. Hearn votes yes. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Neal votes no.
Mr. Neal votes no. Mr. Chairman, I have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
Sorry, are there any? I think there were 24 noes and 18 ayes, so the amendment fails.
Yes, sir.
Are there any other amendments in the amendment, to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.